I imagine stepping into a world that exists now only in stone and silence, a world that once rang with voices in languages older than memory, languages that shaped the air above pyramids and plazas, above cities built when much of Europe still wandered in scattered bands through dark forests. The light here feels different, softer, as if filtered through centuries of mist and moss, and I find myself standing at the edge of something vast, not a place exactly, but a threshold between what was and what remains, between the living pulse of civilizations and the quiet echo they left behind. There are ruins in the jungle, temples rising from green tangles of ceiba and mahogany, their stones fitted so precisely that even now, after 1,000 years of rain and root, no blade could slip between them, and I wonder at the hands that shaped these blocks, the minds that conceived these angles, the voices that once filled these courtyards with prayer and commerce, with laughter and the sharp calls of merchants selling cacao and jade. The air smells of earth and ancient limestone, of rain about to fall, and somewhere in the canopy above, a howler monkey calls, its voice resonating like thunder through the cathedral of trees, the same sound that echoed here when these plazas were new, when the stones were pale and sharp-edged, when incense smoke rose from braziers and the scent of copal resin drifted across terraces crowded with people. I think of the civilizations that flourished here, in Mexico, in the highlands of Guatemala, along the coasts and through the river valleys, down through the isthmus and into the mountains of Peru, cultures that built with stone and adobe, that painted books on bark paper, that charted the movements of Venus with such precision that their calendars rivaled any kept in the Old World. And I feel the weight of that knowledge, the depth of that achievement, settling like dusk over these abandoned courtyards. They rose in waves, these civilizations, each one building upon the knowledge of those who came before. The Olmec carving massive heads from basalt, their features broad and enigmatic, gazing out across the Gulf Coast lowlands, and then the Maya, weaving their cities through the rainforest like beads on a string, each one connected by white roads called sac biob, raised causeways that cut straight through swamp and jungle, and in the highlands, other peoples, the Zapotec, terracing the mountainsides at Monte Alban, the Mixtec crafting gold so fine it seemed to capture sunlight itself, and further south, beyond the jungles, beyond the crystalline lakes of Nicaragua and the volcanic peaks of Costa Rica. The land rises again into the Andes, and there, in valleys so high the air grows thin, other civilizations carved their names into history, the Chavin and the Moche, the Nazca, drawing lines across the desert floor so vast that only the sky could read them, and finally the Inca, whose empire stretched like a spine along the western edge of an entire continent. But I am getting ahead of myself, letting the story tumble forward when it should unfold slowly, like morning light moving across a temple wall, revealing carved glyphs one by one, each symbol a word, each word a window into a way of thinking, a way of seeing the world that was complete and coherent and utterly unlike the one carried across the ocean by Spanish ships. I find myself drawn to the smallest details, the way water was channeled through stone conduits, the way corn, sacred corn, was painted on pottery in blue and yellow and red, the way ball courts were built with sloping walls that caught sound and threw it back, creating acoustics so strange that a whisper at one end could be heard clearly at the other. Engineering feats disguised as simple games. The wind moves through the ruins now, stirring the leaves of strangler figs that have wrapped themselves around doorways, their roots finding purchase in cracks that time has opened in the mortar. And I think how these trees are doing what the jungle has always done, reclaiming what was briefly borrowed, covering the works of human hands with the patient green insistence of growth. There is something deeply peaceful in standing here, in this in-between space where history has gone quiet, where the urgency of empire has faded into the soft background hum of insects, where the only tribute demanded now is the tribute of attention, of noticing, of allowing these stones to speak in their slow and patient way about the people who shaped them and the world they built. And so I begin to walk slowly through centuries, through the long arc of pre-Columbian history, letting each civilization reveal itself in its own time, in its own voice, beginning with the first stirrings of settled life, the first temples, the first cities rising from river valleys and coastal plains. Back when the world was younger and the stones were new, the story begins long before pyramids, long before cities, in a time when the first farmers were learning to coax life from seeds, when wild grasses were being transformed through careful selection and patient hands into something that would sustain empires, maize, the sacred grain that would become the foundation of everything that followed. In the highlands of Mexico, perhaps 8,000 years ago, perhaps longer, people began to notice that certain plants responded to care, that squash grew larger when tended, that beans climbed willingly up corn stalks, that the three together, corn and beans and squash, created a partnership that fed the soil even as it fed the people, the three sisters planted together in mounds, each one giving what the others needed. And maize itself was a miracle of human ingenuity, bred over millennia from a wild grass called teosinte, a plant with seeds so small and hard they barely warranted gathering, but through generation after generation of selection, through the accumulated wisdom of countless farmers whose names are lost, teosinte became maize, its kernels growing large and soft, its ears lengthening, its yield increasing until a single stalk could feed a family for days. This transformation took thousands of years, longer than all of recorded history in the Old World, and it happened in the hands of people who left no written records, who marked their progress only in the slowly changing shape of seeds, in the gradual shift from nomadic hunting to settled villages, from temporary shelters to permanent homes built of adobe and thatch. By 3,000 years before the Common Era, villages were appearing along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, in the humid lowlands where rivers meandered toward the sea, and among these villages, the Olmec were beginning to create something new, something that would set the pattern for all the civilizations that followed. The Olmec are often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, and there is truth in that. They were the first to build ceremonial centers on a monumental scale, the first to develop a complex iconography, the first to play the ritual ball game that would become sacred to every culture that followed, and they worked in stone with a mastery that still astounds. At San Lorenzo, at La Venta, at Tres Zapotes, the Olmec carved colossal heads from basalt, each one weighing many tons, each one depicting a distinct individual, a ruler perhaps, or a revered ancestor their features broad and heavy-lidded, their expressions serene, wearing close-fitting helmets that might have been used in the ball game or might have signified rank and authority. These heads had to be transported from quarries in the Tuxtla Mountains, dragged on wooden rollers, or floated on rafts down rivers, moved across dozens of miles of jungle and swamp by human labor alone. No beasts of burden, no wheels, just ropes and patience and the collective will of a society organized enough to imagine such monuments and committed enough to realize them. And the Olmec created more than heads. They carved jade into ornaments so finely worked that modern jewelers struggle to understand how they achieved such precision. They built earthen platforms that rose like small mountains from the flat coastal plain. They dug drainage systems and shaped the land itself into patterns that served both practical and ceremonial purposes. Their art is filled with a creature that appears again and again, a being with the features of a jaguar and the posture of a human infant. The were-jaguar, its mouth turned down in what might be a snarl or might be the expression of an infant about to cry. And scholars still debate what this figure meant, whether it represented a deity, a mythical ancestor, a shaman transformed, or something else entirely. The jaguar itself was sacred, the great cat that ruled the jungle, that moved through darkness with eyes that caught the faintest light, that killed with a bite to the skull, crushing bone with jaws powerful enough to pierce turtle shells. And the Olmec saw in this creature something divine, something that connected the earthly realm to the supernatural, the underworld to the world of the living. By 1,200 years before the Common Era, Olmec influence was spreading, their distinctive art style appearing in trade goods carried far into the highlands, into the valley of Oaxaca, into the Maya lowlands, and with these trade goods came ideas, beliefs, technologies, the seeds of civilizations that would flower long after the Olmec themselves had faded, and fade they did, though not suddenly. San Lorenzo was abandoned around 900 years before the Common Era, its monuments deliberately defaced, the colossal heads buried, rolled into ravines or interred in ritual deposits, and then La Venta rose to prominence, continuing the traditions, maintaining the ceremonial centers, until it too was abandoned around 400 years before the Common Era. Why these sites were abandoned remains uncertain. Perhaps the rivers changed course. Perhaps the soil grew exhausted. Perhaps there were invasions or internal conflicts. Or perhaps the reasons were spiritual, a sense that the power of these places had waned, that new centers needed to be established where the connection between earth and sky remained strong. But even as the Olmec centers fell silent, their legacy lived on, woven into the fabric of every culture that followed, in the ritual ball game, in the reverence for jade, in the imagery of jaguars and serpents, in the very idea that monumental architecture could serve as a bridge between human society and the divine. Far to the south, in the highlands of Peru, other peoples were also learning to build, to organize, to create permanent settlements around ceremonial centers. At Chavin de Huantar, high in the Andes, a temple complex was taking shape, its stone walls carved with images of beings that combined human and animal features, fanged deities with serpents for hair, shamanic figures in transformation. The Chavin culture flourished from around 900 to 200 years before the Common Era, and like the Olmec, they created an art style that spread far beyond their homeland. their influence radiating out through trade and pilgrimage, through the movement of ideas and iconography, across mountain passes and desert plains. The temple at Chavin de Huantar was built around a series of interior galleries, stone corridors that wound through the heart of the structure, dark and narrow, designed to disorient, to separate the pilgrim from the ordinary world. And at the center of this labyrinth stood the Lanzon, a great granite shaft carved with the image of a deity, a being with fangs and serpent hair, standing in the darkness, illuminated only by light that fell through a shaft from above. Water played a role, too, channeled through stone conduits so that it roared through the galleries, creating a sound like distant thunder, like the voice of the mountain itself. And pilgrims who entered these spaces would have experienced something profound, something that transcended the everyday, a manufactured encounter with the numinous. The Chavin worked gold and silver, hammering sheets thin and embossing them with their distinctive iconography, jaguars and harpy eagles, serpents and centipedes, all the creatures that held power in their cosmology. And these metalworks were traded across vast distances, carried down to the coast, up into the highlands, spreading the Chavin aesthetic and with it, perhaps, their religious ideas. And on the coast itself, other cultures were developing, the Paracas people, living on the arid peninsula that bears their name, were creating textiles of extraordinary complexity, weaving cotton and wool into fabrics decorated with embroidered figures, supernatural beings with streaming appendages, shamans in flight, animals both real and imaginary. These textiles were used to wrap the dead, layer upon layer of fabric encasing mummified bodies, creating bundles that could contain hundreds of individual pieces, each one a masterwork of craftsmanship, each one representing hours of labor, and the dry climate of the coast preserved them, so that colors remain vivid even now, reds and yellows, blues and greens, browns and blacks, each dye extracted from plants or minerals or tiny insects crushed to release their pigment. The dead were important, profoundly important, to these coastal peoples. They were not gone, but transformed, still present in some essential way, still capable of influencing the world of the living, and so they were honored with the finest textiles, with offerings of food and tools, with careful burial in necropolises that grew over generations into cities of the dead. Further north, in the Valley of Mexico, villages were growing around the shores of great lakes, and on the eastern side of the valley, at a place that would become Teotihuacan, people were beginning to gather, drawn by something, perhaps a sacred cave, perhaps a source of obsidian, perhaps just the fertility of the land and the abundance of water. The reasons are lost, but the gathering continued, and a city began to rise. But that city's flowering still lay in the future, in these early centuries. It was just a growing village, one among many, not yet the metropolis that would dominate central Mexico, not yet the place of the gods, as its name would later mean in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, who would find it already ancient, already abandoned, already mysterious, and in the Maya lowlands, in the forests of the Petén, along the rivers that wound through Guatemala and Belize and southern Mexico, villages were also growing. The Maya were beginning to clear forests for fields, to build platforms for temples, to develop the hieroglyphic writing system that would become the most sophisticated in all the Americas. capable of recording not just counts and calendars, but history and poetry, names and deeds, the full complexity of human thought. The early Maya, in what is called the pre-classic period, were already building on a scale that suggests complex social organization. At El Mirador, massive pyramids rose from the forest floor, La Danta, the largest, climbing more than 70 meters into the canopy, its volume exceeding even the Great Pyramids of Egypt, and this was built between 300 years before the Common Era and 100 years after, when Rome was still consolidating its empire, when China was unified under the Han, when much of northern Europe remained beyond the reach of written history. These early achievements are often overlooked, overshadowed by the classic period that would follow, but they reveal something essential, that the foundations of these great civilizations were laid slowly, over centuries of accumulated knowledge, of trial and refinement, of communities learning to work together on projects that transcended individual lifetimes. The Maya understood time in ways that seem almost incomprehensible now. They saw it not as a line stretching from past to future, but as a series of cycles, wheels within wheels, turning and returning, the day count and the year count and the long count, all moving together like gears in some vast cosmic mechanism. And they tracked these cycles with obsessive precision, recording dates on stone monuments called stelae that rose in the plazas of their cities, each one commemorating a ruler's accession or a military victory or the completion of a calendrical cycle. Their mathematics were elegant, based on a vigesimal system, counting by 20s rather than 10s. And they understood zero, not just as a placeholder, but as a concept, a number in its own right, representing completion and potential, emptiness and fullness. And with this mathematics, they calculated the movements of celestial bodies, tracking Venus through its 584-day cycle, noting when it appeared as morning star and when as evening star, knowing that these appearances were moments of power, times when the boundary between earth and sky grew thin. In the great cities of the classic period, Tikal and Calakmul, Copan and Palenque, Yaxchilan and Piedras Negras, the Maya built temples that reached toward the sky, pyramids with steep stairs ascending to shrines where priests communed with gods and ancestors, where blood was offered, the most precious gift, the liquid that carried the life force itself, drawn from tongues and earlobes, from the soft flesh of inner thighs, caught on bark paper and burned so that the smoke would rise, carrying prayers upward, feeding the gods who had given their own blood to create humanity. The creation story told in the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiché Maya, written down centuries later but preserving ancient traditions, speaks of the gods attempting again and again to create beings who would worship them, first making creatures of mud who dissolved in rain, then carving them from wood. But these wooden people had no hearts, no understanding, and so they were destroyed. And finally the gods ground maize, yellow corn and white corn, and from this sacred dough they shaped the flesh of true humans, people who could speak and remember, who could mark the passage of days and honor the divine. And so maize was more than food. It was the substance of humanity itself, and every cornfield was sacred, every planting a ritual, every harvest a gift from the gods who made the rain fall and the sun shine. And when the Maya ate tortillas, thin rounds of corn dough cooked on clay griddles, they were consuming their own essence, participating in the cycle of sacrifice and sustenance that bound earth to sky. The cities themselves were cosmograms, maps of the universe rendered in stone and plaster, the temples oriented to catch the rising sun on solstices, the plazas designed to mirror the shape of creation, and in these spaces ritual dramas unfolded, lords dressed in costumes of jade and feathers, wearing masks of gods, performing dances that reenacted mythological events, the defeat of the lords of death, the resurrection of the maize god, the eternal struggle between order and chaos. Warfare was constant, but it was not the total war of annihilation. It was ritual combat, raids designed to capture nobles for sacrifice, to demonstrate prowess, to take captives who would be brought back to the victor's city and displayed in humiliation before being offered to the gods, their blood sanctifying ball courts and temple stairs. And the ball game itself was a form of ritual combat, players using their hips to strike a solid rubber ball through stone rings, reenacting the mythological game played by the hero twins against the lords of Xibalba, the underworld, a game that ended in death and resurrection, in transformation and renewal. At Palenque, in the Green Mountains of Chiapas, the ruler Kinich Janab Pakal commissioned a tomb for himself deep within the Temple of the Inscriptions, and when he died in his 80th year, having ruled for 68 years, his body was laid to rest in a stone sarcophagus carved with the image of his own death and rebirth, showing him falling down the world tree into the jaws of the underworld, but positioned so that he would rise again, transformed like the sun at dawn, like maize sprouting from planted seed. His jade death mask covered his face, jade beads were placed in his mouth, and jade ornaments adorned his body, because jade was the color of growing corn, the color of water, the color of life itself, more precious than gold, which was valued for its beauty, but not invested with the same spiritual power. And when archaeologists opened that tomb in the middle of the 20th century, the jade still gleamed in the darkness, undimmed by centuries, by the weight of stone and earth. Far to the north, in the basin of Mexico, Teotihuacan had grown into something unprecedented, a true metropolis, perhaps the 6th largest city in the world at its height around the year 500, with a population that might have reached 125,000, living in apartment compounds arranged in a grid, walking streets that ran at right angles, shopping in marketplaces where goods arrived from every corner of Mesoamerica, the city's great avenue called the Street of the Dead by the Aztecs, who would later walk among its ruins, stretched for more than 2 kilometers, lined with temples and platforms, and at its northern end rose the Pyramid of the Moon, massive and steep, while to the east, offset from the avenue, stood the Pyramid of the Sun, one of the largest structures in the ancient Americas, its base covering about the same area as the Great Pyramid of Giza, and beneath it, archaeologists discovered a cave, a natural cavern that had been modified, enlarged, made into something sacred, perhaps the very reason the city was built in this place, a portal to the underworld, an axis mundi, where the 3 levels of the cosmos met. Teotihuacan's influence reached far beyond its valley, its distinctive pottery appearing in Maya sites, its architectural styles copied in distant cities, its talud tablero construction, sloped panels alternating with vertical ones, becoming a signature that marked buildings throughout Mesoamerica, and its gods, the feathered serpent and the rain god. The old fire god depicted as a wizened figure carrying a brazier on his back. These deities were adopted by cultures that would outlast Teotihuacan itself, but who built Teotihuacan remains mysterious. What language they spoke, what they called themselves, whether the city was ruled by kings or priests or some collective council, the stone tells us the what, but not the who. We see the monumental architecture, the painted murals showing gods and priests, processions and rituals, paradises filled with butterflies and flowering trees, but the builders left no written history, no royal names carved in pride. And when the city burned around the year 550, when its great temples were deliberately destroyed and its center abandoned, they left no explanation, only silence and ash. In Oaxaca, the Zapotec had built their city of Monte Alban on a mountaintop, artificially flattening the summit to create a vast plaza surrounded by temples and palaces, and from this height they looked out over the three valleys that met below, controlling trade routes, dominating the region. And they too developed writing, carving glyphs into stone monuments that recorded conquests and genealogies that marked the passage of time according to their own calendrical system. The Zapotec built their city in stages, each generation adding to what came before, raising platforms higher, expanding the plaza, carving more stelae, and some of the earliest monuments showed what are called dansantes, carved figures in contorted poses, once thought to be dancers but now recognized as captives, defeated enemies depicted in humiliation, their bodies twisted, their genitals sometimes exposed, warnings of what happened to those who opposed Monte Alban's power, and in the temples, in the tombs built for nobles beneath the floors of buildings, the Zapotec placed ceramic urns depicting gods, elaborate sculptures showing seated figures wearing masks and headdresses, the rain god Cochillo with his forked serpent tongue, the maize god, the jaguar god, each one watching over the dead, guiding them through the transition from this world to the next. By the year 700, Monte Alban's power was waning. The city still occupied, but no longer the dominant force it had been, and other centers rose in the valleys. Continuing Zapotec traditions, elaborating on them, and the Mixtec, moving down from their mountain homeland, would eventually create kingdoms in these same valleys, producing codices, painted books that recorded their history in pictures and glyphs, showing the conquests of the warlord Eight-Deer Jaguar Claw, his marriages and alliances, his eventual betrayal and sacrifice. The Mixtec were master craftspeople, goldsmiths of extraordinary skill, working metal that had come relatively late to Mesoamerica, introduced from South America through long chains of trade, and they hammered and cast gold into ornaments so fine they seemed more like lace than metal, filigree work that caught light and held it, pectorals and pendants, rings and nose ornaments, created using the lost wax technique, modeling designs in wax, covering them with clay, melting the wax away and pouring molten gold into the void, breaking the mold to reveal the finished piece, each one unique, each one a masterwork. On the coast, along the Gulf of Mexico, the cities of El Tajín and Chempoala flourished, and El Tajín in particular developed the ball game to high art, building at least 17 ball courts, including the South Ball Court with its carved panels showing the rituals associated with the game, players being decapitated, their blood spurting in serpentine streams, death gods receiving offerings, the ball itself depicted as a skull, reinforcing the connection between the game and the underworld, between sport and sacrifice, between death and rebirth. The pyramid of the niches at El Tajin rose in 7 tiers, each one adorned with square niches, 365 in total, one for each day of the solar year, and scholars believe offerings were placed in these niches, perhaps on specific days, connecting the architecture to the calendar, making the building itself a kind of 3-dimensional almanac, a stone monument to the passage of time. And in the Maya lowlands, even as some cities declined, others rose to prominence. Chichen Itza in the northern Yucatan, with its great pyramid called El Castillo, designed so that on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the setting sun creates a shadow that appears to be a serpent descending the staircase, the body formed by triangular shadows cast by the pyramid's corners, the head carved in stone at the base, a feat of astronomical observation and architectural precision. Chichen Itza showed influences from central Mexico, from Toltec culture, suggesting contact, conquest, or cultural exchange, and in the city's great ball court, the largest in Mesoamerica, carvings showed the outcome of the game, players kneeling, one beheaded, his neck spurting serpents instead of blood, and whether this depicted the winning or losing team remains debated, because for the Maya, sacrifice was an honor, a transformation, a way of feeding the gods and ensuring the continued turning of the cosmic wheels. In the highlands of central Mexico, a people called the Toltec were building their capital at Tula, constructing temples adorned with massive stone warriors, Atlantean figures standing 4.5 meters tall, carved columns representing armed men in ceremonial dress, feathered headdresses and butterfly-shaped pectorals, atlatls held ready, the spear throwers that could send a dart through armor, and these stone warriors supported the roof of a temple, their eternal vigilance suggesting the militant nature of Toltec society. The Toltec flourished between the years 900 and 1200, and their influence spread far, or so the later Aztecs believed, claiming Toltec ancestry for their own nobility. Speaking of Tula as a golden age, a time when artists were true masters, when craftsmen worked with unparalleled skill, when the corn grew so large that a single ear required both arms to carry. Whether these memories were history or mythology is uncertain, but the Toltec became legendary, their name itself meaning master builders, skilled artisans, and every later ruler sought to connect their lineage to this prestigious past. At Tula, the Toltec built a chak mul, a reclining stone figure with head turned 90 degrees, belly flat to receive offerings, and this form would be copied throughout Mesoamerica, appearing at Chichen Itza and later at Tenochtitlan, always positioned before temple doorways, always ready to receive the hearts and blood that fed the gods. And the chakmul became so widespread that it suggests either conquest or profound cultural influence, ideas traveling along trade routes, pilgrims carrying home what they had witnessed, artists inspired by distant forms. But Tula too fell, burned around the year 1150, its temples toppled, its warrior columns broken and buried, and the Toltecs scattered, some perhaps moving to the Maya lands, others merging with peoples in the Valley of Mexico, and in their wake came a period of migration, of smaller states rising and falling, of confederations and alliances, until the Mexica, who would come to be called Aztecs, arrived in the valley. The Mexica were late comers, migrants from somewhere in the north, from a place they called Aztlan, and they wandered for generations, following the guidance of their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird god of war, until they came to the Valley of Mexico, to the lakes that filled its floor, and there they were unwelcome, regarded as barbarians by the established city-states, pushed to the margins, to swampy islands in the lake, and on one of these islands, according to their histories, they saw the sign their god had promised, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent, and they knew this was their home. They called the place Tenochtitlan, the place of the prickly pear, cactus, and they began to build, driving pilings into the lake bed, creating chinampas, floating gardens of incredible fertility where crops could be planted year-round, the water providing constant moisture, the lake bottom providing rich muck for fertilizer, and these chinampas allowed the city to feed itself even as it grew, even as its population swelled to perhaps 200,000, making it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. The Mexica were fierce warriors, and they were skilled diplomats, forming the Triple Alliance with Texcoco and Tlacopan, 3 cities sharing power, dominating the valley and then expanding outward, demanding tribute from conquered cities, taking cacao and cotton, jade and feathers, warriors for sacrifice and women for marriage, building an empire that stretched from coast to coast, from the cold northern deserts to the tropical south, an empire held together by military might and the constant threat of force. And at the center of Tenochtitlan rose the Templo Mayor, the great temple, a twin pyramid with shrines to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the war god and the rain god, the 2 forces that sustained the empire, military conquest and agricultural abundance. And on the steps of this temple, sacrifice was performed on a scale that shocked even the battle-hardened Spanish conquistadors. Hearts torn from living chests, bodies rolled down the stairs, skulls placed on racks called zompantli, thousands upon thousands of them, arranged in careful rows, a forest of death designed to intimidate visitors and honor the gods who demanded such offerings. The Mexica believed that the sun itself required blood to rise each morning, that without constant sacrifice the cosmic order would collapse. The sun would fail to move across the sky. Darkness would consume the world, and so the wars of flowers were fought. Xochitlotl, ritual battles arranged between allied cities for the express purpose of taking captives for sacrifice. Warfare as religious duty, as cosmic necessity. But Tenochtitlan was more than a center of sacrifice. It was a city of gardens and markets, of schools where young nobles learned poetry and rhetoric, where commoners learned trades. It was a city with a zoo where Moctezuma kept jaguars and eagles, a place where hundreds of servants cleaned the aviaries daily, where rare animals from across the empire were displayed. And there was a botanical garden where medicinal plants were cultivated, studied, their properties catalogued by physicians who understood herbalism with sophisticated precision. In the great market at Tlatelolco, adjacent to Tenochtitlan, goods from every corner of the empire were traded, vendors selling gold and silver, turquoise and jade, cacao beans that served as currency, cotton mantles in plain and patterned weaves, live rabbits and dogs bred for eating, pottery and obsidian blades, flowers and feathers, and the market was so large that Spanish soldiers who saw it compared it favorably to the markets of Constantinople, marveling at its organization, its variety, its sheer abundance. Far to the south, in the Andes, other empires had risen and fallen. The Moche on the northern coast of Peru, building massive huacas, adobe pyramids that dominated the landscape, and painting pottery with such artistry that each vessel told a story. Warriors in combat, shamans transforming, sexual acts rendered in explicit detail, a ceramic record of daily life and ritual practice. The Mochi bury their lords in splendor, as archaeologists discovered when they excavated the tombs at Sipan, finding a ruler interred with gold and turquoise, copper and silver, accompanied by retainers who were sacrificed to serve him in death, and the gold work was extraordinary, hammered into the shapes of peanuts and beans, creatures of sea and land, headdresses that caught sunlight and transformed the wearer into something more than human. The Nazca, in the southern coastal desert, created the lines that bear their name, geoglyphs scraped into the desert floor, removing the dark surface stones to reveal lighter sand beneath, and these lines stretched for kilometers, forming geometric shapes and animals, a hummingbird and a spider, a monkey with a spiraled tail, a condor with outstretched wings, and they were so large that their full shapes could only be seen from the air, leading to wild speculation about their purpose, about why a culture would create images meant to be viewed by the gods. But perhaps that was exactly the point. These were offerings made visible to the sky, prayers rendered in stone and sand, and walking the lines was a form of pilgrimage, a ritual act that connected the living to the landscape, to the water sources that meant survival in this driest of deserts, because many of the lines pointed toward mountains where water originated, where aquifers began, where the precious liquid that sustained life had its source. And then came the Inca, Tawantinsuyu. They called their empire, the four parts together, and it was the largest empire in pre-Columbian Americas, stretching from modern Ecuador through Peru and Bolivia into Chile and Argentina, held together by roads that ran for thousands of kilometers, paved highways that climbed mountain passes and descended into river valleys, suspension bridges woven from grass cables that spanned impossible gorges, way stations called tambos, where travelers could rest, and imperial messengers called chasqui could exchange messages carried in the form of quipus, knotted strings that recorded numbers and possibly narratives, a form of record-keeping that remains only partially understood. The Inca built, without mortar, fitting stones so precisely that their buildings survived earthquakes that toppled Spanish colonial structures built on top of them. At Sacsayhuaman, above Cusco, massive boulders, some weighing over 100 tons, were shaped to fit together in interlocking patterns, polygonal blocks with multiple faces, each one grinding against its neighbors, and how the Inca moved these stones, how they shaped them with such precision using only stone hammers and bronze chisels, remains a testament to their engineering genius and their organizational capacity. Machu Picchu, the royal estate built by the Emperor Pachacuti, clung to a mountain ridge between two peaks, its terraces stepping down impossible slopes, its temples aligned to catch the solstice sun, its location so remote that Spanish conquistadors never found it, and it remained hidden lost to the outside world until an American historian stumbled upon it in the early 20th century, finding stones still fitted perfectly, fountains still flowing with water channeled through stone conduits, a city frozen in time. The Inca worshipped the sun Inti, who was both deity and ancestor, the divine father of the royal lineage, and they covered their most sacred temple, the Coricancha in Cusco, with plates of gold, the walls literally sheathed in the sun's metal, and inside, gold statues of corn and llamas, a garden where every plant was crafted from precious metal, a representation of abundance and divine favor, all of which was melted down by Spanish conquistadors, transformed from sacred art into bullion, shipped across the ocean to fill European coffers. But before the Spanish came, before smallpox raced ahead of the conquistadors, killing perhaps half the population, before civil war divided the empire between two brothers claiming the throne, the Inca presided over a civilization of remarkable complexity, a state without money or markets, where labor was the currency, where every subject owed service to the state, building roads and terraces, serving in the army, weaving textiles, and in return the state provided for them, storing grain in vast warehouses against times of famine, redistributing goods to ensure no region went hungry. And so the great civilizations of the Americas reached their zenith, each one distinct in its art and architecture, in its beliefs and practices, yet all connected by shared histories, by trade routes that carried goods and ideas, by the fundamental questions that every civilization must answer: how to organize society, how to feed cities, how to explain the cosmos and humanity's place within it, how to honor the dead and prepare for the future. These were questions answered not with words alone, but with stone and gold, with pottery and textiles, with the careful arrangement of cities, and the precise calculation of celestial movements, with pyramids that touched the sky and roads that connected mountains to sea, with art that captured the divine and technology that transformed the landscape, and standing now among the ruins, feeling the weight of centuries in these silent stones, there is a sense of something immense, something that cannot quite be grasped in its totality. Civilizations that rose and fell according to rhythms we can only partially understand, that left behind fragments, clues, beautiful and mysterious things that speak across the gulf of time in voices we must strain to hear. The stones remember what we have forgotten. They hold within them the touch of hands that shaped them, the voices that echoed in the plazas they enclosed. And walking among them now, there is a feeling of presence, as if the past is not truly past, but layered beneath the present, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be understood. These civilizations understood cycles in ways we have largely lost. They saw time not as progress toward some distant goal, but as eternal return, the planting and harvest, the dry season and the rains, the rising and setting of celestial bodies. And they built their cities and their calendars around these rhythms, aligning themselves with patterns larger than individual human lives, larger even than the lifespan of empires, the mathematics they developed, the astronomy they practiced. These were not abstract exercises, but sacred sciences, ways of reading the intentions of the gods written in the movements of the sky. And when a Maya priest calculated that Venus would appear as morning star on a particular day centuries in the future, this was both prediction and prayer, an assertion that the cosmic order would continue, that the sun would keep rising, that the world would persist. Their architecture speaks of this understanding. Pyramids as artificial mountains connecting earth to sky, ball courts as portals to the underworld, plazas as mirrors of creation, every major structure serving double duty as functional space and cosmological statement, so that simply by moving through a city, by climbing temple stairs or crossing a plaza, a person participated in the structure of the universe, their daily movements becoming ritual, becoming prayer. And the art they created was never merely decorative. Every carved glyph carried meaning. Every painted mural told stories that reinforced social order and religious belief. Every ceramic vessel, even those used for everyday purposes, bore images that connected the mundane to the sacred, so that eating from a bowl decorated with the maize god was a reminder of humanity's debt to the divine, of the sacrifice that made life possible. The textiles, too, especially those of the Andes, were more than clothing. They were records, genealogies woven into cloth, patterns that identified lineage and region, and the finest textiles, those with thread counts rivaling modern fabrics, those dyed with pigments that required months to prepare. These were reserved for the gods and the dead, for those who stood at the boundary between worlds, mediating between human concerns and cosmic forces. Water was sacred, profoundly sacred, because in lands where drought could mean starvation, where the difference between abundance and famine often came down to the timing of rains, control of water was both practical necessity and spiritual imperative, and so we see elaborate hydraulic systems, aqueducts and reservoirs, fountains and drainage channels, all designed with mathematical precision, all serving the dual purpose of meeting physical needs and honoring the rain gods who provided this most essential element. The ritual of bloodletting, so disturbing to modern sensibilities, made perfect sense within their cosmology. The gods had given their blood to create humanity, grinding their bones and mixing them with divine blood to form the first people, and so humans owed a blood debt, a debt that could only be repaid through sacrifice, through offering back what had been given. And this was not seen as cruel, but as reciprocal, as maintaining the balance that kept the cosmos functioning. Even warfare, brutal and constant though it was, served cosmological purposes. Captives were needed not just to demonstrate power, but to provide offerings, to feed the sun, to ensure agricultural fertility. And so battles were fought according to ritual rules during specific seasons, with the goal not of annihilation, but of capture, of taking living prisoners who could be brought home and sacrificed in elaborate ceremonies that the entire city witnessed, that reinforced shared beliefs and collective identity. The foods they cultivated, maize and potatoes, beans and squash, tomatoes and cacao, these would eventually transform global cuisine, becoming staples in diets across continents. But before they were commodities, they were sacred. Each plant a gift from specific deities, each harvest a miracle that required human cooperation with divine forces. And even now, in highland villages, farmers still perform rituals before planting, still speak to the earth, still honor the old gods under new names. Their medical knowledge was extensive. They performed surgery, trepanation, drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure or release evil spirits, and many patients survived, their skulls showing evidence of healing, Bone growing back around the surgical opening, they set broken bones, treated wounds with poultices made from plants whose antibiotic properties modern science has confirmed. They understood the medicinal uses of thousands of species, knowledge accumulated over millennia, tested and refined through countless generations. And their cities were not frozen monuments, but living spaces, constantly being rebuilt, expanded, modified. The Maya practice of building new structures over old ones means that major temples are like architectural onions, layer upon layer, each one representing a different phase, a different ruler, a different vision of the relationship between earth and heaven. And excavating these layers is like reading backwards through time, uncovering older versions, earlier attempts to bridge the gap between human and divine. The collapse of these civilizations, when it came, was rarely sudden. The Maya cities of the southern lowlands were abandoned gradually over a century, their populations dispersing, moving north or into the highlands, and the reasons remain debated. Drought certainly played a role. Warfare probably contributed. Perhaps there was environmental degradation, deforestation leading to erosion, intensive agriculture exhausting the soil, or perhaps the political and religious system simply became unsustainable, the demands for labor and tribute growing too heavy, the cosmic bargain becoming too expensive. But collapse is perhaps the wrong word, because the people did not disappear. Their descendants lived throughout Mexico and Central America, speaking languages that evolved from those spoken in the ancient cities, practicing rituals that blend pre-Columbian traditions with later influences, weaving textiles using techniques that stretch back thousands of years, and in their persistence, in their continuity, there is a kind of victory, a refusal to be erased, a quiet insistence that the past remains present. The Spanish conquest brought catastrophe, not just a military defeat, but demographic collapse on a scale almost unimaginable, diseases for which indigenous peoples had no immunity, smallpox and measles, typhus and influenza, racing through populations, killing in waves, reducing the population by perhaps 90%, emptying cities and villages, breaking the continuity of knowledge and tradition, destroying codices, toppling temples, melting gold and jade, attempting to erase entire cosmologies and replace them with European beliefs. But erasure was never complete. The old gods persisted under the names of saints. The old rituals continued in the ceremonies of the church, and in the mountains, in remote villages, in the hearts of people who remembered. The ancient ways survived, went underground, waited for times when they could resurface, when they could be spoken aloud again, when the grandchildren and great-grandchildren could reclaim what had been taken. And now, standing in the quiet that has settled over these stones, there is a sense of something ending and beginning simultaneously. The end of one way of understanding, the beginning of another, the realization that these civilizations were not primitive or savage or inferior, but complex and sophisticated and fully human, that their achievements rival any in world history, that their art and architecture, their science and mathematics, their philosophy and spirituality deserve to be understood on their own terms, not as curiosities, but as legitimate expressions of human genius. The light is changing now, the way light changes in the hour before darkness, becoming softer, more forgiving, and the stones seem to glow with accumulated warmth. Heat absorbed during the day now radiating back, And there is a quality to this moment, a sense of suspension, as if time itself has paused, as if past and present have momentarily aligned. I think of all the people who walked here, who climbed these stairs and entered these temples, who stood in these plazas and watched ceremonies, who lived entire lives within sight of these walls, who were born and married and died knowing only this landscape, this cosmos, this way of being in the world. And I feel the weight of their absence, the silence where their voices should be. But I also feel their presence in the stones themselves, in the careful fit of each block, in the precise alignment of each doorway, in the glyphs that still proclaim names and dates and deeds, in the art that still speaks of gods and myths and the endless human attempt to understand existence. And there is comfort in this, in knowing that something persists, that even in ruins there is testimony, that even in silence there are stories waiting to be heard. The shadows are lengthening now, stretching across plazas, climbing temple walls, and the jungle is beginning its evening chorus. Insects and birds, frogs calling from pools of water, the sound building gradually, layer upon layer, until the air itself seems to vibrate, and somewhere in the distance a howler monkey calls, that deep resonant voice that could be mistaken for thunder, or for the voice of the earth itself. And I find myself grateful to have walked here, to have stood in these spaces, to have felt, however briefly, however imperfectly, some connection to the people who built these cities and temples, who cleared these forests and terraced these mountains, who looked up at the same stars and asked the same fundamental questions. Who are we? Why are we here? What happens when we die? And what obligations do we owe to the forces that sustain us? The answers they found were different from those we might give, but they were complete answers, coherent within their own logic, beautiful in their complexity, and worthy of respect, worthy of study, worthy of remembrance. And as the light continues to fade, as the temples merge with the shadows and the jungle presses closer, I carry these thoughts with me, these images of stone and jade, of pyramids and plazas, of civilizations that rose and fell like the sun they worshipped, leaving behind these monuments, these memories, these whispers in stone. I drift upward tonight into a vastness that has no edges, no walls, no horizon line to anchor the eye. Above me stretches something older than memory, older than language, a darkness punctuated by light, by ancient fires burning across distances so immense that the mind can only translate them into metaphor, into poetry, into wonder. The cosmos spreads in every direction, silent, luminous, impossibly grand. I imagine standing in a field far from any city, far from the glow of streetlights and the hum of civilization, where the sky opens like a great cathedral dome, and the stars emerge one by one, then by the hundreds, then by the thousands, until the entire vault above shimmers with points of light that seem to breathe. The Milky Way becomes visible as a river of faint luminescence, a band of gossamer light stretching from one edge of a vision to the other. And I realize that this river is not merely decoration, not simply a backdrop, but home, a galaxy containing hundreds of billions of stars, and we are within it, part of its slow rotation, part of its ancient dance. Cosmology is the word we use for this contemplation, this attempt to understand the universe as a whole, its origins, its structure, its evolution across time, scales that dwarf human history, that make empires seem like heartbeats and mountains seem like passing thoughts. It is both science and philosophy, both calculation and wonder, a discipline that asks the oldest questions while using the newest tools, that measures light that has traveled for billions of years to reach our instruments, our eyes, our awareness. Tonight I float within this inquiry, within this grand narrative that connects the smallest particles to the largest structures, that traces a line from the first moments of existence to this present instant, to this breath, this observation. The darkness above is not empty, it is full, teeming with galaxies beyond counting, with nebulae where stars are born, with the invisible scaffolding of dark matter that holds everything together in patterns we are only beginning to perceive. And somehow, in some way that still feels miraculous, we are able to read this darkness, to interpret its messages, to decode the light that has journeyed across the void, carrying information about events that happened long before our sun ignited, long before our planet cooled, long before life began its slow elaboration into consciousness. The story of cosmology is also a story of human curiosity, of our species looking upward and asking questions that seemed unanswerable, then finding ways to answer them, step by patient step, generation after generation, building instruments and theories and mathematical frameworks that could extend our senses beyond their natural limits. We have gone from naked eye observations, from counting the visible stars and noting their patterns, to detecting radiation from the edge of the observable universe, from the boundary between existence and whatever lies beyond. We have learned to read time itself in the spectrum of distant light, to see the universe not as it is now, but as it was, to look outward and simultaneously look backward through history, through epochs when galaxies were younger, when the cosmos was hotter and denser, when everything was closer together in ways that challenge imagination. The universe has a story, a biography written in light and gravity, and the motion of vast structures through space, and we have learned slowly, carefully, to read that story. Tonight I follow this narrative, this cosmological tale that begins in mystery and unfolds into understanding, that traces the evolution of everything, from a state we can barely conceptualize to the rich complexity we observe around us, within us. The air is still, the night is deep, and the cosmos waits with infinite patience, holding its secrets and its revelations in perfect balance, ready to be contemplated, ready to be understood as fully as our minds and instruments will allow. I feel myself settling into this exploration, into this slow journey through space and time and thought, through theories and observations, through the accumulated wisdom of centuries of inquiry. The darkness above contains multitudes, and I am ready to dwell within them, to move through this landscape of understanding at the pace of deep attention, of careful consideration, of wonder that needs no hurrying. The universe expands, and so does this moment of contemplation, stretching outward into detail, into nuance, into the rich texture of cosmic history. The story begins, as all stories must, with questions asked under ancient skies, long before telescopes, before mathematics, before the scientific method emerged from centuries of philosophy. Human beings looked upward and wondered, what is this vast arena? How did it come to be? What forces govern the motion of celestial lights across the darkness? The earliest cosmologies were woven from mythology and observation, from the need to understand our place within something greater, something that operated according to patterns we could sense but not yet fully explain. In Mesopotamia, was more than 4,000 years ago, astronomers tracked the movements of planets against the fixed stars, noting their retrograde motions, their conjunctions, building elaborate tables that predicted celestial events with surprising accuracy. They saw the cosmos as layered, as structured, with the earth at the center and the heavens arranged in crystalline spheres that rotated with perfect regularity, carrying the sun and moon and wandering stars through their appointed rounds. This geocentric vision would dominate human thinking for millennia, not because ancient peoples were foolish, but because it matched what eyes could see, what experience suggested. The earth feels stationary, the heavens appear to move. The Greeks refined these ideas, giving them geometric precision, mathematical rigor. Aristotle proposed a universe of concentric spheres, each carrying a celestial body, all rotating around the fixed earth, with the outermost sphere containing the fixed stars, and beyond that sphere nothing, not even space, just the absolute boundary of existence itself. This was cosmology as philosophy, as logic applied to observation, an attempt to create a coherent picture of the whole, to answer questions about the fundamental nature and structure of reality. Ptolemy, working in Alexandria in the 2nd century, created the most sophisticated geocentric model, a system of circles upon circles called epicycles that could predict planetary positions with remarkable accuracy. His Almagest became the astronomical textbook for more than 1,000 years, a testament to human ingenuity, to our ability to create mathematical models that capture the behavior of nature even when the underlying principles remain hidden. But observation is patient, and over centuries, small discrepancies accumulated, tiny differences between prediction and reality that whispered of deeper truths waiting to be discovered. The medieval Islamic scholars preserved and extended this knowledge, building observatories, refining measurements, asking their own questions about the nature of the heavens. They developed instruments of breathtaking precision, astrolabes and quadrants and armillary spheres, tools that transformed starlight into data, into numbers that could be analyzed and compared across generations. Al-Sufi cataloged the stars. Ibn al-Haytham explored the nature of light itself. Al-Biruni measured the Earth's circumference with stunning accuracy, each contribution adding to humanity's growing understanding of the cosmic stage. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, different cosmologies flourished. The Hindu vision of cyclical time and vast cosmic ages, the Chinese conception of celestial harmony reflecting earthly order, the Mesoamerican calendars that tracked celestial cycles with extraordinary precision. Each culture looked upward and found patterns, found meaning, found ways to connect human life to cosmic rhythms. Then came the shift, the great revolution that would transform cosmology from philosophy into science. Nicholas Copernicus, working in the early 16th century, proposed something radical, something that contradicted direct experience. He suggested that the Earth moves, that it orbits the sun along with the other planets, that we are not the center, but participants in a larger dance. His model was not immediately more accurate than Ptolemy's, but it was simpler, more elegant. It required fewer epicycles, fewer adjustments. It suggested that nature might favor simplicity over the apparent testimony of the senses. He published his great work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, in 1543, the year of his death, setting in motion a transformation that would take more than a century to complete. Tycho Brahe, the great Danish observer, spent decades making naked eye measurements of unprecedented precision, tracking planets and stars night after night, building a vast database of positions and motions. He could not accept Copernicus fully, could not believe the Earth moved, but his data would prove essential, the raw material from which new understanding would crystallize. His assistant, Johannes Kepler, inherited these observations and spent years trying to make sense of them, trying to find the pattern that would unite theory and measurement. Kepler discovered something unexpected, something that seemed almost arbitrary at first. The planets do not move in perfect circles, but in ellipses, with the sun at one focus, sweeping out equal areas in equal times. These laws of planetary motion, published in the early 1600s, marked a profound shift. Nature did not obey the classical preference for circular perfection, but followed mathematical rules that could be discovered through patient analysis of data. And then came Galileo, turning the newly invented telescope toward the heavens and seeing what no human eye had ever seen. Mountains on the moon, showing that celestial bodies were not perfect spheres of ethereal substance, but worlds, places with topography and texture. 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, proving that not everything circles the Earth, that there are other centers of motion, other systems within the larger system. Phases of Venus demonstrating that Venus orbits the Sun, not the Earth, that the Copernican model better matched reality. The Milky Way resolved into countless stars, suggesting that the universe was far vaster than anyone had imagined, that what appeared as milky luminescence was actually composed of distant suns, uncountable in their multitude. These observations, published in 1610 in the Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, opened new vistas, new questions, new possibilities. Cosmology was becoming observational, empirical, grounded in data that anyone with a telescope could verify, but the theoretical framework was still incomplete, still lacked the unifying principle that could explain why planets move as they do, what force governs their paths. Isaac Newton provided that principle in 1687 with his Principia Mathematica, perhaps the most influential scientific work ever written. Gravity, the universal force of attraction between all masses, acting across empty space, diminishing with the square of distance. This single idea could explain terrestrial motion and celestial motion with the same mathematics. The moon orbits the Earth because gravity pulls it inward, but its forward motion prevents it from falling, creating a stable orbit, the same principle that keeps planets circling the sun, that governs the motion of binary stars and distant galaxies. Newton's cosmology was mechanical, predictable, a clockwork universe operating according to deterministic laws, where knowing the present state allowed calculation of all future states, where mystery seemed to dissolve into mathematics. This Newtonian cosmos dominated thinking for more than 2 centuries, universe infinite in extent, eternal in duration, filled with stars scattered through limitless space, all pulling on each other with gravity, all moving according to precise mathematical laws. It was a universe that seemed complete, stable, fundamentally understandable through human reason and calculation. Observers mapped the heavens in ever greater detail. William Herschel discovered Uranus, proving the solar system was larger than the ancients knew. He counted stars in different directions, trying to map the shape of our stellar system, and concluded we inhabit a disk-like structure, an island of stars in an infinite void. The great question became, are the nebulae, those faint fuzzy patches visible in telescopes, part of our stellar system, or are they separate islands, separate galaxies lying at unimaginable distances? This question would not be answered for more than a century, but it hovered at the edges of cosmological thinking, suggesting that even the Newtonian universe might be far stranger and vaster than it appeared. The 19th century brought new tools, new methods. Spectroscopy allowed astronomers to analyze starlight, to determine what stars were made of, to measure their motions through space. Light itself became a messenger, carrying information encoded in its colors, its wavelengths, its patterns of absorption and emission, and slowly, through accumulated observations and theoretical developments, cosmology approached its next great transformation, the one that would show that the universe itself has a history, that it evolves, that it had a beginning, but that revolution still lay ahead, waiting in the early decades of the 20th century, waiting for new observations and new theories to converge, to reveal a cosmos far more dynamic than Newton ever imagined. The early 20th century arrived with new questions stirring beneath the surface of established knowledge, with anomalies that classical physics could not quite explain, with observations that hinted at deeper mysteries. Albert Einstein was working as a patent clerk in Bern, thinking about light, about motion, about the nature of space and time themselves, and in 1905 he published his special theory of relativity, showing that time and space are not absolute, not fixed, but relative, dependent on the observer's motion. This was strange enough, revolutionary enough, but it was only the beginning. He continued thinking, continued pushing, asking what happens when acceleration enters the picture, when gravity becomes part of the story, and in 1915, after years of intense mathematical struggle, he completed his general theory of relativity. Gravity, Einstein showed, is not a force in the Newtonian sense, but a curvature of space-time itself. Mass bends the fabric of reality, and objects moving through curved space-time follow paths that appear curved to us, that we interpret as the effect of gravitational attraction. This was cosmology at its most fundamental, a complete reimagining of the stage on which cosmic events unfold. Space and time were no longer passive containers, but active participants, dynamical entities that could bend and flex and ripple. And if space-time could curve, if it could respond to the presence of mass and energy, then perhaps the universe as a whole could have a geometry, a shape, a structure that could be described mathematically and tested against observation. Einstein applied his equations to the universe itself, treating all of existence as a single system, and he found something unexpected, something that troubled him deeply. His equations predicted that the universe should either expand or contract. It could not remain static. Gravity would either pull everything together into eventual collapse, or some other force would drive everything apart. But the universe appeared static, Stars seemed fixed in their positions, scattered eternally through infinite space. So Einstein modified his equations, adding what he called the cosmological constant, a kind of anti-gravity that could hold the universe in balance, preventing collapse, maintaining the eternal static cosmos that observation seemed to demand. This was one of the few times Einstein's physical intuition failed him, one of the few times he adjusted his mathematics to match preconception rather than following where the equations led. Meanwhile, other physicists were exploring the implications of general relativity, applying it to cosmology, finding solutions to Einstein's equations that describe different possible universes. Alexander Friedman, working in Russia, found solutions that described expanding universes, contracting universes, universes with different geometries and different fates. He showed mathematically that a dynamic cosmos was not only possible, but natural within Einstein's framework. Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest and physicist, independently reached similar conclusions and went further, suggesting that if the universe is expanding now, then it must have been smaller in the past, denser, hotter, and if we trace this expansion backward far enough, we reach a moment of beginning, a point of origin he called the primeval atom. This was a radical idea, a universe with a history, with a definite starting point, with an evolution from some initial state toward the present configuration. But theory alone cannot establish truth. Observation must guide understanding, and the crucial observations were beginning to accumulate. Besto Slipher, working at Lowell Observatory, had been studying the spectra of spiral nebulae, and he found something remarkable. Most of them showed redshifts. Their light was shifted toward longer wavelengths, suggesting motion away from us. Edwin Hubble, using the powerful 100-inch telescope at Mount Wilson, was able to resolve individual stars in some of these spiral nebulae, and among them he found Cepheid variables, stars whose brightness pulses with a period related to their intrinsic luminosity. By measuring the period and comparing the apparent brightness to the known luminosity, he could calculate distance, and the distances he found were enormous, far beyond the boundaries of our own galaxy, proving that these nebulae were indeed separate galaxies, island universes scattered through the vastness of space. And in 1929, Hubble published a finding that would transform cosmology. He showed that the redshifts Slipher had measured were related to distance. The farther away a galaxy, the faster it appeared to be receding. The universe was not static, but expanding, with every galaxy moving away from every other galaxy, as if space itself was stretching, carrying galaxies along with it. This was the observational confirmation that Friedman and Lemaitre had predicted. The universe has a dynamic character. It evolves, it changes, and if it is expanding now, then it must have been smaller and denser in the past. Einstein, when he learned of Hubble's observations, reportedly called his cosmological constant his greatest blunder. The universe did not need to be held static. It wanted to expand, and he had missed the opportunity to predict this before observation revealed it. The expanding universe became the foundation of modern cosmology, but it raised profound questions. If everything is moving apart, if we trace this expansion backward, what do we find at the beginning? Lemaitre's primeval atom, The idea that the universe began in an extremely hot, extremely dense state gradually gained acceptance through the 1930s and 40s, though it remained controversial, difficult to test, almost philosophical in its implications. The term Big Bang was coined later by Fred Hoyle, ironically during a radio broadcast where he was arguing against the theory, preferring instead his steady state model in which the universe had no beginning, with new matter continuously created to fill the gaps left by expansion. But evidence continued to accumulate. George Gamow, along with Ralph Alpher and Robert Herman, applied nuclear physics to the early universe, showing that in the extreme heat of the first minutes, nuclear reactions would have created the light elements, hydrogen and helium and traces of lithium, in proportions that matched what astronomers observed. And they made a prediction. If the early universe was hot and dense, filled with radiation, then as space expanded, that radiation would cool, stretch to longer wavelengths, and it should still be present, filling all of space, a faint microwave glow, the afterglow of creation itself. This prediction was largely forgotten until 1964, when Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, working at Bell Labs with a sensitive radio antenna, detected an annoying background noise, a hiss that came from all directions equally, that would not go away no matter how they adjusted their equipment. They cleaned out pigeon droppings from the antenna, checked every possible source of interference, but the signal remained. Uniform, persistent, mysterious. Nearby, at Princeton, physicists Robert Dicke and Jim Peebles had been working on the same prediction Gamow had made. They were planning to search for this cosmic background radiation, and when they heard about Penzias and Wilson's mysterious signal, they realized what it was. The cosmic microwave background, the relic radiation from the Big Bang, the oldest light in the universe, now cooled to just a few degrees above absolute zero, but still present, still detectable, still carrying information about the early universe. This discovery, announced in 1965, won Penzias and Wilson the Nobel Prize, and it effectively ended the debate between Big Bang and steady-state cosmologies. The universe had a hot, dense beginning, and we could see the evidence. We could detect the afterglow. Cosmology became a precision science. Observers mapped the cosmic microwave background with increasing accuracy, detecting tiny variations in temperature, tiny ripples that represented the seeds of all future structure, the slight density variations that would eventually grow into galaxies and clusters and superclusters. Theorists developed Daltrow's detailed models of the universe's evolution, starting from quantum fluctuations in the earliest moments, through the formation of the first atoms, the dark ages when no stars yet shone, the ignition of the first generation of massive stars, the assembly of galaxies, the large-scale structure we observe today. Each stage of this history could be studied, modeled, tested against observation. The universe revealed itself as something with a narrative, with chapters and transitions and causal connections spanning billions of years. New questions emerged. What caused the Big Bang? What happened in the very first moments? Why does the universe have the properties we observe, the specific balance of matter and energy, the particular values of fundamental constants that allow complexity to arise? Alan Guth, in 1980, proposed cosmic inflation, a brief period of exponential expansion in the first tiny fraction of a second, Driven by a special kind of energy field, this inflation could explain why the universe appears so uniform on large scales, why its geometry appears flat, why we do not observe certain exotic particles that early universe models predicted. Inflation became part of the standard story, though details remained debated, questioned, refined through ongoing research, and observers continued pushing boundaries, building larger telescopes, more sensitive detectors, space-based observatories that could see wavelengths blocked by Earth's atmosphere. The Hubble Space Telescope, launched in 1990 after initial problems were corrected, began returning images of unprecedented clarity. Deep field observations that showed galaxies by the thousands stretching back through cosmic time, revealing the universe as it was billions of years ago, younger, denser, different in character. Cosmology had become a field where observation and theory danced together, where mathematical models made predictions that could be tested, where unexpected discoveries led to refined theories that led to new predictions, an iterative process of understanding that built layer upon layer of knowledge. The universe was no longer a static mystery, but a dynamic, evolving system, readable, comprehensible, full of stories waiting to be deciphered from the light that crosses space and time to reach our instruments, our eyes, our wondering minds. The closing decades of the 20th century brought new puzzles, new discoveries that challenged and extended the cosmological framework. Astronomers studying the rotation of galaxies found something unexpected. Stars at the edges of spiral galaxies were moving too fast, far faster than visible matter alone could explain through gravity. They should have been flung into intergalactic space, but they remained bound, orbiting steadily. Vera Rubin and Kent Ford conducted careful observations of galaxy rotation curves, measuring velocities at different distances from galactic centers, and the pattern was clear. Galaxies contained far more mass than we could see, invisible matter that revealed itself only through gravitational effects. This dark matter, as it came to be called, was not merely present, but dominant, making up roughly 85% of all matter in the universe, shaping the formation of galaxies, holding clusters together, creating the gravitational scaffolding on which visible structures assembled. Yet its nature remained mysterious. It did not emit light, did not absorb light, did not interact with the electromagnetic radiation in any way we could detect. It was present only as gravity, as curvature in space-time, as the invisible architecture of the cosmos. Candidates were proposed to exotic particles predicted by extensions of the standard model of particle physics, objects called WIMPs, weakly interacting massive particles, or axions, or other possibilities. But despite decades of searching, dark matter has not been directly detected. It remains one of cosmology's great open questions. And then came an even stranger discovery. In the late 1990s, two teams of astronomers were studying distant supernovae, exploding stars of a particular type that serve as standard candles, objects whose intrinsic brightness is known, allowing distance to be calculated from apparent brightness. Both teams, one led by Saul Perlmutter, the other by Brian Schmidt and Adam Rees, were trying to measure how the expansion of the universe was slowing down. Everyone expected expansion to be decelerating, slowed by the gravitational pull of all the matter in the universe. The question was only how much. But the observations showed something astonishing. The expansion was not slowing, but accelerating. Distant supernovae were farther away than they should be if expansion had been constant or decelerating. The universe was speeding up, expanding faster and faster as time went on. This made no sense in conventional terms. What could push galaxies apart? What force could overcome gravity on cosmic scales and cause acceleration? The answer, or at least the label, for our ignorance became known as dark energy, something that fills space itself, that has negative pressure, that pushes outward rather than pulling inward. And this dark energy comprises roughly 68% of the total energy content of the universe. Einstein's cosmological constant, the term he had added and then abandoned, suddenly became relevant again. Dark energy behaves mathematically like a cosmological constant, a property of space itself that does not dilute as the universe expands. The universe we inhabit, we discovered, is mostly invisible. Roughly 5% ordinary matter, the stuff of stars and planets and living beings, 27% dark matter, and 68% dark energy. We live in a cosmos we barely understand, swimming in mysteries we can measure but not yet explain. Precision cosmology emerged in the early 21st century. Missions like WMAP, the Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy Probe, and later Planck, mapped the cosmic microwave background with exquisite detail, measuring tiny temperature variations to millionths of a degree, extracting from these ripples a wealth of information about the universe's composition, age, geometry. From these observations, combined with galaxy surveys and supernova studies and other data streams, cosmologists assembled a standard model, sometimes called lambda, CDM, for cosmological constant and cold dark matter, a mathematical description of the universe that fits observations remarkably well. This model tells us the universe is 13.8 billion years old, that it is spatially flat, infinite in extent if the geometry holds at the largest scales, that it will continue expanding forever, accelerating endlessly, with galaxies moving apart until, in the far future, most will disappear beyond our cosmic horizon. Large sky surveys mapped millions of galaxies, revealing the cosmic web, the large-scale structure of the universe, with galaxy clusters connected by filaments surrounding vast voids, creating a pattern that resembles foam or neural networks, structures that emerged from tiny quantum fluctuations in the earliest moments, amplified by inflation grown through gravitational collapse over billions of years. Simulations run on powerful computers could reproduce this structure, starting from initial conditions and applying known physics, watching virtual universes evolve, comparing the results to actual observations, refining our understanding of how gravity and dark matter and dark energy interact to create the cosmos we inhabit. Gravitational wave detectors came online, LIGO and Virgo, detecting ripples in space-time from colliding black holes and neutron stars, opening a completely new window on the universe, allowing us to observe events invisible to telescopes, confirming predictions Einstein made a century ago. Each new capability, each new instrument, each new wavelength explored revealed more complexity, more structure, more history encoded in the light and gravity waves crossing space. Cosmologists pushed toward the earliest moments, the first second, the first tiny fractions of a second, when the universe was so hot and dense that ordinary physics breaks down, when quantum mechanics and gravity must somehow merge, when the fabric of space-time itself may have been quantum, fluctuating, probabilistic? Questions multiplied even as answers accumulated. What triggered inflation? What is the inflaton field that drove it? Why did inflation end when it did? What happened before the Big Bang? Or does that question even make sense if time itself began with the Big Bang? The multiverse emerged as a possibility. Perhaps our universe is one of many. Perhaps inflation creates pocket universes endlessly, each with potentially different physical constants, different laws, and we inhabit one that happens to allow complexity, allows atoms and stars and life to exist, not because of design, but because we could only exist in such a universe, an anthropic selection effect. These ideas remained speculative, at the boundary between physics and philosophy, difficult or perhaps impossible to test. Yet they arose naturally from extensions of theories that work well in describing our own universe. Cosmology had become vast in scope, connecting the smallest scales explored by particle physics to the largest scales we can observe, unifying quantum mechanics with general relativity, at least in principle. Though the detailed theory of quantum gravity remained elusive, the James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021, began observing the earliest galaxies, systems that formed when the universe was only a few hundred million years old, revealing that galaxy formation happened faster, more efficiently than models had predicted, adding new puzzles to solve, new parameters to adjust. Each generation of instruments revealed phenomena the previous generation could not see. Each answered old questions while raising new ones. The process of discovery accelerated even as the frontier pushed toward limits that might be fundamental, toward regimes where our theories might break down, where new physics waits to be discovered. The universe revealed itself as almost impossibly old, vast beyond human comprehension, yet knowable, describable, governed by laws we could discover and test. It was simultaneously strange and familiar, alien and intimate. It operated on scales that dwarf human concerns, yet it produced, through patient evolution, the conditions for complexity, for stars and planets, for chemistry and biology, for minds capable of contemplating their own cosmic context. Modern cosmology stands as perhaps humanity's greatest intellectual achievement, a synthesis of observation and theory, mathematics and physics, technology and imagination that allows us to trace the history of everything from a hot, dense beginning to the present moment, to predict its future evolution into a cold, dark, eternally expanding vastness. And yet, with all this knowledge, with all these measurements and models and confirmed predictions, the deepest questions remain open, touched but not answered, approached but not resolved, waiting at the horizon of understanding. Why does the universe exist at all? Why these laws and not others? Why this exquisite balance that allows structure to form? These questions hover at the edge of physics, perhaps beyond physics, yet they arise naturally from the cosmological narrative, from the story we have learned to read in starlight and cosmic radiation. The journey from ancient skywatchers to precision cosmology spans thousands of years, hundreds of generations, each contributing observations or theories or mathematical tools, each adding to the collective understanding, building a picture of reality that would have seemed impossible, magical to our ancestors. Yet here we stand, inhabitants of a universe we can comprehend, at least partially, at least enough to know both what we understand and what remains mysterious, The mind stretches when contemplating these scales, these durations, these distances that cannot be truly visualized, only approached through metaphor and mathematics. 13.8 billion years, a number we can write, a figure we can measure with surprising precision. Yet what does it mean to hold that span of time in awareness, to feel the weight of it, the immensity? If we compressed the entire history of the universe into a single year, with the Big Bang occurring at the first moment of January 1st, then the Milky Way galaxy would form in mid-March. Our solar system would condense in early September. The first life on Earth would appear in late September, and all of recorded human history would fit into the final minute before midnight on December 31st. We are latecomers, recent arrivals, participants in a story that began long before our existence and will continue long after. Yet here we are, made of atoms forged in stellar furnaces, carbon and oxygen and nitrogen and iron, elements created through nuclear fusion in the cores of stars, then scattered through space when those stars died, seeding new generations of stars and planets, including the world that gave us birth. We are quite literally stardust, the universe contemplating itself, matter organized into patterns capable of thought, of wonder, of tracing the narrative that produced us. This is perhaps the most profound implication of modern cosmology. Not merely that the universe is old and vast, but that it has a creative capacity, an ability to generate complexity, to produce through purely physical processes, operating over billions of years, the conditions for life, for consciousness, for beings who can look back and understand their own origins. The cosmic microwave background, that faint glow we detect from all directions, represents photons that have been traveling for more than 13 billion years. They decoupled from matter when the universe was only 380,000 years old, when it cooled enough for the first atoms to form, and they have been journeying through expanding space ever since. When we observe this radiation, we are seeing the universe as it was near the beginning, looking back through time, observing conditions that existed long before stars, before galaxies, before any structure we would recognize. This is time travel of a sort, observation as archaeology, light as a historical record. Every photon carries information encoded in its wavelength, its polarization, its direction, and from millions or billions of photons, we can reconstruct the state of the early universe, can test our theories against actual data from epochs no human will ever visit. The large-scale structure we observe, the cosmic web of galaxy clusters and filaments, grew from tiny quantum fluctuations, random variations in density that existed when the observable universe was smaller than a single atom. Inflation stretched these microscopic irregularities to cosmic proportions, and then gravity, operating patiently over billions of years, amplified them, pulling matter into denser regions, creating the first stars, the first galaxies, assembling them into ever larger structures, randomness and law working together, quantum uncertainty providing the seeds, deterministic gravity nurturing their growth, producing the intricate architecture we observe spanning billions of light years, and dark energy ensures this structure is temporary. Already, galaxy clusters at the edge of the observable universe are moving away faster than light can travel through the expanding space between us. They are disappearing beyond our cosmic horizon, leaving our observable patch of the universe forever. in the far future, trillions of years from now, if any observers remain, they will see a lonelier cosmos, just our local group of gravitationally bound galaxies, surrounded by darkness, by empty expanding space. They will not be able to detect the cosmic microwave background, will not be able to see distant galaxies, will not have access to the evidence that allowed us to reconstruct cosmic history. We live in a special epoch, a time when the universe is old enough to have produced observers, but young enough that evidence of the Big Bang remains accessible, visible, detectable. This seems almost fortuitous, that we emerged when we could still see our origins, still piece together the story. Though of course this is selection bias. Observers must arise when conditions allow observation. The mystery of fine-tuning hovers over cosmology, the observation that fundamental constants appear calibrated to allow complexity. If gravity were slightly stronger, stars would burn out too quickly for life to evolve. If it were weaker, stars might never form. If the strong nuclear force were slightly different, elements necessary for chemistry might not exist. Some see this as evidence of design, others as evidence of a multiverse where all possible values occur. And we inhabit a universe with parameters that allow our existence. Others simply note the observation without claiming to explain it. Science operates best when it acknowledges the boundaries of its methods, when it recognizes questions that may lie beyond empirical investigation, or at least beyond current capabilities. Cosmology has pushed these boundaries further than perhaps any other science, starting from observations of light and gravity, building mathematical models, testing predictions, extending our understanding from the present moment back toward the beginning and forward toward the ultimate fate. We know the universe will expand forever, accelerating, growing colder and darker. Stars will eventually exhaust their fuel. Black holes will gradually evaporate through Hawking radiation over unimaginable timescales. And eventually, in the far future, the universe may reach a state of maximum entropy, heat death, where no organized structures remain, no gradients, no possibility for complex processes. But that ending lies trillions upon trillions of years ahead, beyond the scope of concern, beyond the reach of prediction, given how much physics we still do not understand. For now, in this epoch, in this moment, the universe is rich with structure, with galaxies forming stars, with planets orbiting those stars, with at least one world where life has emerged and evolved into beings capable of cosmic self-awareness. And that awareness itself is part of the story, consciousness arising from matter, from atoms, from the same fundamental particles and forces that govern stars and galaxies, suggesting a continuity, a unity between the observer and the observed. We are not separate from the cosmos we study, but expressions of it, local configurations of matter and energy that have organized into patterns capable of reflection, capable of understanding, capable of wonder. The night grows deeper now. The stars remain steady in their ancient patterns, yet behind their apparent fixity lies all this hidden motion, this expansion, this evolution, this vast narrative of becoming. I feel myself settling into silence, into the quiet that follows understanding, or at least the approximation of understanding that humans can achieve. The universe does not offer simple answers. It offers complexity, nuance, layers of explanation that lead to further questions. a fractal depth that rewards investigation without ever quite reaching a final resolution. And perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps this is how things should be. A cosmos that reveals itself gradually, that maintains mystery even as it yields to inquiry, that stays interesting, worthy of continued contemplation. The ancient questions remain, transformed but not eliminated by modern knowledge. We know how the universe evolved from a hot, dense state, but not why it began, not why these laws, not why anything exists rather than nothing. Philosophy and physics meet at these horizons. Science describes the how with increasing precision, but the why remains elusive, perhaps unanswerable, perhaps requiring different kinds of thinking, different modes of inquiry. But cosmology has given us something precious, a narrative framework, a story that connects the smallest and largest, the earliest and latest, that places human existence within a cosmic context, that shows us simultaneously how vast the universe is and how we are part of it, woven into its fabric, products of its evolution. We emerged from stardust. We live briefly in the current epoch. We observe and wonder and try to understand. And eventually we return to the cosmos that produced us, our atoms recycling into new configurations, new possibilities. There is something beautiful in this, something that transcends the cold mathematics and abstract physics, a kind of poetry in the realization that we are the universe experiencing itself, matter becoming conscious, capable of tracing its own history. The darkness above holds all of this, holds galaxies and dark matter and dark energy, holds the cosmic microwave background, holds the ongoing expansion that will continue long after our sun fades, our galaxy dims, our local structures dissolve. But in this moment, in this present instant, the cosmos exists in a state of magnificent complexity, full of stars and planets, full of processes and patterns, full of stories being written in light and gravity across distances that dwarf imagination. And somewhere in this vastness, on a small world orbiting an ordinary star, minds have emerged that can comprehend, at least partially, the grand narrative, the cosmological story that encompasses everything. This is cause for wonder, for gratitude, for a kind of cosmic humility that recognizes our smallness while celebrating our capacity to understand, to observe, to piece together the story from fragments of light that have traveled billions of years to reach us. The stars fade slowly as I release this contemplation, as awareness settles back toward the immediate, toward the present moment, toward the quiet night. The universe continues expanding, evolving, generating its endless variations, indifferent to observation, yet somehow producing observers, producing consciousness, producing this moment of understanding. And that is enough, more than enough, to fill the darkness with meaning, to transform the night into a cathedral of knowledge and wonder, to connect this brief human awareness to the vast sweep of cosmic time. The silence deepens, the contemplation fades, and the universe remains patient, eternal, magnificent in its complexity, holding everything, including this moment, including this awareness, including the story we have learned to read in starlight. There is a stillness that settles over the world in the quietest hours, a kind of soft dissolving, where the edges of things become less certain and the mind begins to float just slightly above itself, It is in those moments that certain ancient ideas seem most alive, not because they are distant or difficult to reach, but because they were always waiting there, patient, unhurried, breathing gently beneath the surface of ordinary thought. Tonight we are drifting toward the east, not across any physical distance, but across something older and more interior than geography. We are moving toward a way of seeing the world, a collection of philosophies so vast and so luminous that they have shaped the inner lives of more human beings than perhaps anything else ever conceived. Imagine, for a moment, a landscape at the very edge of dawn. The sky is a deep, soft indigo, just beginning to soften at the horizon into the faintest wash of amber and rose. Below it, mountains rise in gentle silhouette, their peaks unhurried, their slopes covered in the quiet green of ancient forests. A river winds through the valley between them, slow and reflective, carrying on its surface the last of the night's dark stillness. Somewhere along that river there is a lamp burning. It sits in the window of a low building, a monastery, perhaps, or a scholar's dwelling, made of weathered stone and worn timber, its walls carrying the memory of countless seasons. The light it casts is the color of warm honey, and it touches the mist that drifts in from the mountains with a kind of reverence. This is where we begin. Eastern philosophy was not born in a single place or a single moment. It arose slowly and organically, the way a river gathers itself from 100 quiet tributaries, from mountainsides and hidden springs, from rain falling on upland meadows and snow melt tracing invisible paths through stone. Over thousands of years, across vast and varied civilizations, human minds turned inward and asked questions so fundamental, so quietly radical, that the answers they offered are still being explored, still being lived, still being whispered from teacher to student in rooms lit by that same amber glow. What is the nature of the world, and what is my place within it? How should a life be lived, and what does it mean to live it well? Is there a self, a true enduring self, or is the very notion of a separate self one of the great misunderstandings of conscious experience? These were not questions asked in a hurry. They were the questions that emerged in silence and contemplation, in the long, unhurried hours of minds devoted entirely to the work of understanding. And the answers that arose were not like declarations or commands. They were more like invitations, doorways opened gently, without insistence, into gardens of extraordinary depth and calm. The traditions that carry these questions are many. Hinduism, one of the oldest living philosophical and religious traditions in human history, with its vast architecture of thought stretching back more than 3,000 years, perhaps much further. Buddhism, born in the foothills of the Himalayas and carried by wandering teachers and traders to every corner of Asia and eventually the whole world. Taoism, rooted in the paradoxical wisdom of ancient China, always pointing towards something that cannot quite be named. Confucianism, which turned its attention not to the cosmos, but to the intimate texture of human relationships and ethical life. Zen and Jainism and the great Vedantic traditions, each one a universe of thought in itself, yet all of them sharing something, a quality of attention, a willingness to sit with mystery, a deep trust in the power of stillness. There is something remarkable about the way these traditions arose. Historians sometimes speak of a period called the Axial Age, roughly spanning from approximately 800 to 200 BCE, during which, seemingly independently, some of the most penetrating minds in human history appeared all at once across different civilizations. In India, the sages of the Upanishads were composing some of the most breathtaking philosophical poetry ever written. In China, Laozi was said to be tracing the first brushstrokes of the Tao Te Ching. Confucius was walking the dusty roads of the Zhou kingdom, speaking with kings and students alike. The Buddha was sitting beneath a tree in the forest of Bodh Gaya, moving through the final hours of a journey that would change the world. It is as though something in the human spirit reached a particular ripeness all at once, as though the questions had been accumulating in the dark, like water gathering behind a dam, until they finally broke through and flowed. The lamp in the window flickers once, softly. A moth circles near his glass, drawn by warmth and light, neither approaching too closely nor moving away. The mist has thickened slightly in the valley, and the river is invisible now beneath it, present only as a sound, a low and steady murmur, like a voice reciting something remembered from long ago. There is a word in Sanskrit, dhyana. It means something like meditative absorption, a state of consciousness in which the ordinary chatter of thought grows quiet and the mind becomes clear and still, like the surface of a mountain lake at daybreak. This word traveled as so many ideas do, carried by wandering teachers along trade routes and pilgrimage roads. In China it became Chan, in Japan it became Zen, and in its long journey it gathered new meanings, new expressions, new forms, yet always keeping within it that original quality of radical stillness. That is what Eastern philosophy is, in some essential way, a practice of stillness, not the stillness of inertia or emptiness, but the stillness of something fully alive and fully present, like the pause between two notes in a piece of music, which is not silence, but the very thing that gives the notes their meaning. Tonight, we are settling into that pause. We are not rushing toward any conclusion or destination. We are simply here in the amber light, with the mountains watching silently from the dark, and the river murmuring somewhere beneath the mist, and all around us, stretching in every direction, deeper than the sky, the accumulated wonder of thousands of years of human beings, asking the same quiet, extraordinary questions, and slowly, very slowly, we begin to listen. The questions did not arise all at once. They gathered slowly, the way sediment gathers at the bottom of a still pool, layer by layer, grain by grain, over spans of time so vast that the human mind can only gesture toward them the way one might gesture toward the horizon from a hilltop, knowing the land continues far beyond what the eye can see. The oldest roots of Eastern philosophy reach down into the civilization of ancient India, into a culture so ancient that its earliest texts predate written history as most of us understand it, carried instead in the extraordinary medium of human memory, chanted, recited, passed from teacher to student across generations, like a flame carried carefully through the wind. These earliest teachings were the Vedas. The word Veda itself comes from a Sanskrit root, meaning knowledge, or more precisely, the kind of knowledge that is seen rather than learned, perceived rather than reasoned, arriving the way light arrives through a gap in the clouds. The Vedas were composed in a form of Sanskrit so archaic that even ancient Indian scholars, thousands of years after their composition, studied them with the careful reverence one might give to something half understood and wholly sacred. The oldest of the four Vedas, the Rig Veda, is believed to have been composed somewhere between 1500 and 1200 BCE, though some scholars suggest portions may reach back considerably further. It consists of more than 1,000 hymns addressed to the forces and presences that ancient Indian seers perceived as alive within the world: fire, wind, dawn, the great cosmic order underlying all things. But even within these earliest hymns there is something stirring beneath the surface, a restlessness of inquiry, a sense that the singers of these hymns are not merely praising external forces, but reaching towards something they can barely articulate, something about the nature of existence itself, something about the mysterious ground from which all things arise. One of the most remarkable hymns in the entire Rigveda is the Nasadya Sukta, sometimes called the Hymn of Creation. It was composed at a time when most human cultures were building their cosmologies on stories of divine craftsmen and celestial battles, and yet this hymn does something entirely different. It asks, "At first there was neither being nor non-being, neither air nor sky beyond it. What was concealed where, in whose care? Was there water, deep unfathomable water? Who really knows? Who can say where this creation came from and whether it was willed or not? Only the one who surveys it from the highest heaven knows, and perhaps even that one does not know. Read those words again slowly and let their strangeness settle. This is not a creation myth. It is a philosophical poem about the limits of knowledge itself, composed perhaps 3,000 years ago in a language spoken in the river valleys of what is now northwestern India and Pakistan. It is an act of radical intellectual humility, and it sets the tone for so much of what Eastern philosophy would become. As centuries passed and the Vedic tradition deepened, new layers of reflection began to accumulate. The Vedas gave rise to the Brahmanas, elaborate prose texts explaining the ritual dimensions of the hymns, and then, at the very edges of the forest, something else began to emerge. The Aranyakas, the forest texts, were composed for those who had withdrawn from the bustle of village and ritual life to sit in quieter places and think. And from the Aranyakas came the Upanishads, perhaps the most extraordinary flowering of philosophical thought in the ancient world. The word Upanishad is often translated as sitting near, as in sitting near a teacher, close enough to receive teachings that cannot be shouted across a distance, but must be given quietly, person to person, in the space of genuine attention. There are more than 200 Upanishads, though traditionally 10 to 13 are considered the principal ones. They were composed over a long span, roughly from 800 to 200 BCE, by unknown authors who wrote not as individuals claiming credit, but as voices giving form to something they felt had always been true. The Upanishads are not systematic philosophy in the way that term might be understood in a Western academic tradition. They are more like conversations, dialogues between teachers and students, between kings and wandering sages, between a father and his son, sitting together in the long twilight of an afternoon. They circle their subjects the way a bird circles a thermal, rising gradually, approaching from different angles, never quite landing on a final answer, but drawing ever closer to something felt deeply and understood intuitively. And at the center of almost everything the Upanishads explore, there are two great concepts. The first is Brahman. Brahman is not easily translated, and perhaps that difficulty is itself instructive. It points toward the ground of all being, the underlying reality from which the entire universe arises and into which it finally dissolves, not a god in the personal sense, not a craftsman who built the world, but something more like the very fabric of existence itself, the silent, luminous, infinite presence within which all things appear and disappear like waves on the surface of an ocean. The second concept is Atman, the inner self, the witness within, the presence that watches thoughts arise and pass away, that remains somehow untouched by the turbulence of experience, as still and clear at the center of a human life as that mountain lake at dawn. And then, in what may be the single most audacious philosophical proposition ever quietly stated, the Upanishad suggests that these two are the same. Brahman and Atman are not different things. The ground of the universe and the ground of the self are one continuous reality. The infinite and the intimate are, at the deepest level, not two. This proposition, expressed most famously in the formula Tat Tavam Asi, meaning that thou art, would echo through thousands of years of Indian thought, inspiring commentaries and counter-commentaries, schools of interpretation, and entire traditions of practice devoted to the direct experience of what the texts are pointing toward. Meanwhile, in the foothills of the Himalayas, in what is now southern Nepal and northern India, a young man of extraordinary sensitivity was moving through a life of privilege that no longer satisfied him. His name, according to tradition, was Siddhartha Gautama, and he was born, most historians believe, sometime in the 5th or 6th century BCE, though the exact dates have long been a subject of careful scholarly discussion. The stories that surround his early life have the quality of myth, because they are myth in the deepest sense of that word, not falsehood, but a narrative that carries truth in its images rather than its historical details. He was said to have been raised in a palace, sheltered from suffering by a father who loved him and feared a prophecy. He was said to have encountered, for the first time in his sheltered life, an old man, a sick person, a corpse, and a wandering ascetic, and to have been so struck by the fact of human suffering that the ordinary pleasures of his privileged life became impossible to hold on to. He left. He wandered for years among the great forest of spiritual seekers that populated ancient India at that time, for it was a remarkable era, teeming with philosophers, ascetics, debaters, meditators, and questioners of every kind. He studied with the best teachers available to him and mastered their systems, and found each time that something essential still felt unresolved. He practiced severe physical austerity, the path of the great Jain tradition, among others, which held that the liberation of the spirit required the disciplining of the body to its very limits. He grew so thin, the texts say, that he could feel his spine when he pressed his hand to his stomach, and still the great question remained open. Then, exhausted and near collapse, he accepted a bowl of rice milk from a young village woman named Sujata. He sat beneath a tree, a fig tree, a pipal tree, the species now known throughout the world as the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening, and he made a quiet resolve. He would sit until he understood. What followed, according to the tradition, was a night of profound inner experience, a movement through increasingly deep states of consciousness, a seeing through of the mechanisms of suffering and craving, a direct perception of the interconnected, impermanent, causally arising nature of all experience, and as the morning star appeared in the pre-dawn sky, something clarified. The texts say he looked up and saw the morning star and said, in a moment that carries the quality of pure wonder rather than triumph, "How extraordinary! How extraordinary! All beings are already endowed with the wisdom and virtue of the awakened ones." This is the central insight of early Buddhism, the thing that sets it apart and makes it so quietly radical. The Buddha, a title meaning the awakened one, did not claim to be a god or a divine messenger. He claimed to be a human being who had understood something that any human being could, in principle, understand. He was pointing at a path, not a destination exclusive to himself. What he taught in the decades that followed, wandering the roads of northeastern India with a growing community of students, was organized in his first formal teaching around what became known as the Four Noble Truths. The first truth is dukkha, often translated as suffering, though the word carries richer overtones. It points toward the pervasive quality of unsatisfactoriness that runs through ordinary experience, the sense that even beautiful things are shadowed by the knowledge of their impermanence, that even pleasure contains within it the seed of the longing for more. The second truth points to the origin of this suffering, tanha, craving, the reaching after experience, the pushing away of what is unwanted, the fundamental restlessness of a mind that cannot simply be with what is. The third truth is the extraordinary one, that this condition is not permanent, that there is a possibility of freedom from craving, a way of being in the world in which experience is met with full presence rather than grasping or aversion. And the fourth truth is the path, the eightfold path of right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, a way of living that gradually, gently, without violence to the self, untangles the knots of craving and clears the ground for something luminous to emerge. And so, in those early centuries, two great rivers of thought were already flowing through the ancient East. The vast, deep current of Vedic and Upanishadic wisdom, with its insight into the unity of self and cosmos, and the clear, methodical, compassionate stream of early Buddhism, with its meticulous attention to the mechanics of suffering and freedom. But the landscape of thought was even richer than this. To the northeast, in ancient China, another tradition was stirring, quieter, more paradoxical, harder to grasp precisely because it insisted so firmly that it could not be grasped. There was an old archivist, it is said, a keeper of records in the royal court of the Zhou dynasty, whose name was Laozi. The historical details surrounding him are uncertain, as they are with so many figures from this extraordinary era, and some scholars have suggested that Laozi may have been more legend than person, a name that means simply the old master or the old one. But the text attributed to him, the Tao Te Ching, is undeniably real and undeniably extraordinary. It consists of 81 short chapters, most of them barely a page in length, written in a classical Chinese of such compressed elegance that scholars have spent thousands of years debating the meaning of individual characters. At its heart is a single irreducible concept, the Tao, translated as the way, or the path, or simply as that which cannot be named. The Tao is presented as the underlying principle of the universe, the source from which all things arise, the process by which all things unfold, the ground into which all things finally return. It is not a god, not a law, not a force in any mechanistic sense. It is more like the grain of the wood, the natural pattern running through all of existence, which can be followed or resisted, but never ultimately escaped. The Tao Te Ching opens with one of the most famous sentences in all of world philosophy. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. In 12 simple characters, the entire project of the text announces itself, not as a system of knowledge to be mastered, but as a gesture towards something that exceeds all systems, all words, all frameworks. It is a philosophy built on the radical acknowledgement of its own limits. And yet within that acknowledgement, something extraordinary blooms. The river moves on through the night, carrying its ancient water toward the sea, and the lamp in the window burns with a steady, patient flame. The philosophy that emerged from the Tao Te Ching was not a philosophy of striving. It was something almost entirely opposite to that. It pointed toward a quality of being that Laozi called Wu Wei, a concept so central to Taoist thought that no single English word can contain it, though many have tried. Wu Wei is often translated as non-action or effortless action, or acting in accordance with the natural flow of things. But these translations, however careful, still risk suggesting a kind of passivity, a mere sitting still while the world turns, and that is not quite it. Wu Wei is more like the action of water. Water does not force its way through stone. It finds the low places, the cracks, the paths of least resistance, and over time, over long, patient, unhurried time, it shapes mountains, hollows canyons, carries continents grain by grain toward the sea. It acts without straining, without ambition, without the tense forward-leaning quality that human effort so often carries. And yet nothing in the natural world is more transformative. This is what Laozi was pointing toward, a way of moving through life that is aligned with the grain of things rather than against it, a leadership that governs by creating the conditions for things to flourish rather than imposing its will, a wisdom that knows when to step back as surely as it knows when to act. And the Tao Te Ching is filled with paradoxes that carry this quality. The most yielding thing in the world overcomes the hardest. The sage accomplishes everything by doing nothing. To know others is wisdom. To know oneself is enlightenment. These are not riddles designed to frustrate. They are invitations to a different mode of understanding, one that loosens the grip of the analytical mind and opens something quieter and more spacious within. A generation or so after Laozi, another voice arose in China that would shape Eastern thought with equal, though very different, force. Confucius was born in the state of Lu in 551 BCE, in a period of profound political instability known as the Spring and Autumn period. The Zhou dynasty, which had once provided a framework of order and ritual for Chinese civilization, was fracturing. Rival states competed for power, old hierarchies were dissolving, and the question of how human beings ought to live together, how society ought to be organized, how rulers ought to govern, how individuals ought to treat one another, had become urgently, desperately practical. Where Laozi turned his gaze toward the ineffable ground of the cosmos, Confucius turned his gaze toward the human world, toward the intimate, everyday texture of relationships and responsibilities. He was not, by most accounts, a particularly lucky man. He spent much of his adult life seeking a position of influence from which he could put his ideas into practice, wandering from state to state with a group of devoted students, offering his counsel to rulers who would listen, moving on when they would not. He died in 479 BCE without ever having achieved the political influence he sought. And yet his ideas outlasted every dynasty that dismissed him. At the heart of Confucian thought is a concept called Ren, pronounced something like Ren with a rising tone, often translated as benevolence or humaneness or loving kindness toward others. It is the quality of genuine care for other human beings, not as an abstract principle, but as something practiced in the specific, concrete relationships of daily life. For Confucius, the fundamental unit of moral life was not the individual, it was the relationship. And he identified 5 relationships as the primary architecture of a well-ordered human world: ruler and minister, parent and child, husband and wife, elder sibling and younger sibling, friend and friend. Each relationship, properly lived, was characterized by specific responsibilities and a quality of genuine care flowing in both directions. This was not a philosophy of blind obedience, though it has sometimes been misread that way. It was a philosophy of mutual cultivation. The ruler who governs well earns genuine loyalty. The parent who raises children with wisdom and love receives filial devotion not as a demand but as a natural flowering of the relationship. The friend who is truly present and honest cultivates the kind of friendship that steadies and deepens both lives. Confucius believed that the transformation of society began with the transformation of the self, and that the transformation of the self was a lifelong project of moral cultivation, study, and practice. He called the ideal human being the Yunzi, the noble person, or the exemplary person, not noble by birth, but noble by the quality of their character and their commitment to ethical life. Learning without thinking is useless, he said. Thinking without learning is dangerous. These 2 great streams, Taoism and Confucianism, would flow alongside each other through Chinese civilization for more than 2,000 years, sometimes in tension, sometimes in dialogue, sometimes merging in the thought of individual philosophers who drew from both. They would be joined eventually by a 3rd great current. Buddhism arrived in China gradually, carried along the Silk Road by traders and monks from Central Asia, beginning in the 1st century CE. Its arrival was not a sudden illumination, but a slow permeation, like ink dropped into a bowl of water, spreading gradually, changing everything it touched while being changed in turn. The encounter between Buddhism and Chinese thought was one of the most creative collisions in intellectual history. Early Buddhist translators struggled to find Chinese words adequate to Sanskrit concepts that had no precise equivalent in Chinese philosophical vocabulary. They reached naturally toward the vocabulary they had, often toward Taoist terminology. Tao was used to translate the Buddhist concept of the path. Wu Wei was used to gesture toward the Buddhist quality of non-attachment. And in this reaching, something new began to form. Over centuries of this creative exchange, a distinctly Chinese form of Buddhism emerged, one that preserved the core of the Buddha's original teaching while taking on the coloration of Chinese sensibility, its love of paradox, its appreciation for the concrete and the immediate, its deep respect for the natural world. This Chinese Buddhism eventually gave rise to the tradition known as Chan, which, as noted earlier, is the Chinese rendering of the Sanskrit dhyana. And Chan Buddhism, carried to Japan in the 12th and 13th centuries, would become Zen, one of the most widely recognized Eastern philosophical traditions in the modern world. But before Zen emerged in Japan, something extraordinary was happening back in India. After the Buddha's death, or parinirvana, the final passing beyond the cycle of birth and death, his teachings were preserved and transmitted by a growing community of monks and nuns. They were organized, memorized, debated, and eventually, centuries after his death, written down in the extraordinarily precise and beautiful language of Pali and later in Sanskrit. As the centuries passed, the Buddhist community began to fracture, not with animosity, but with the natural diversity of interpretation that any living tradition accumulates over time. Different schools developed different emphases, different philosophical orientations, different understandings of what liberation meant and how it was to be pursued. One of the most significant of these developments, which emerged gradually between approximately the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, was the movement that called itself the Mahayana, the Great Vehicle, or, in contrast to the earlier tradition, it respectfully disagreed with, a path wide enough to carry not just dedicated monastics, but all beings, everywhere, toward awakening. The Mahayana introduced a new ideal, the Bodhisattva. A Bodhisattva is one who has developed the aspiration to attain awakening not for personal liberation alone, but for the sake of all beings, who turns back again and again from the threshold of final liberation, moved by compassion for the suffering of the world, who dedicates every action, every breath, every moment of practice to the well-being of others. This was a philosophical shift of enormous consequence. It moved the center of gravity of Buddhist practice from the individual pursuit of liberation to something more like an infinite, selfless dedication to the liberation of all. And it opened the tradition to new philosophical explorations of breathtaking depth. Among the most important of these was the philosophy of sunyata, emptiness. The great Mahayana philosopher Nagarjuna, who likely lived in the 2nd century CE, developed what became known as the Madhyamaka, the middle way philosophy, in a series of texts of such logical precision and philosophical daring that they remain studied and debated in Buddhist academic communities to this day. Nagarjuna's central argument was that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence. This does not mean that things do not exist. It means that they do not exist in the way we habitually assume they do, independently from their own side with solid, fixed, intrinsic natures. Instead, everything that exists, every person, every object, every moment, every thought, exists in dependence upon other things, arises in dependence upon causes and conditions, exists in dependence upon the parts that compose it, is identified in dependence upon the conceptual frameworks we bring to it. Nothing stands alone. Nothing is self-sufficient. Everything arises together in a web of mutual dependence so total and so intimate that the very distinction between self and other begins to soften at the edges. This concept, pratitya samutpada, dependent origination, was present in the earliest teachings of the Buddha, but Nagarjuna drew out its implications with a philosophical rigor that transformed it into one of the most sophisticated ontological frameworks ever developed. And then there is the philosopher who took Nagarjuna's insights and carried them in a different but equally profound direction. Vasubandhu, who lived in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, developed what is known as the Yogacara, the yoga practice school, sometimes also called the Vijnanavada, or consciousness-only school, Where Nagarjuna had established the emptiness of all phenomena, Vasubandhu turned his attention to the nature of consciousness itself. What we experience as the external world, he argued, is not separate from the mind that perceives it. It arises within consciousness, shaped by consciousness, inseparable from the act of knowing. This was not a claim that the physical world does not exist. It was a subtle and careful examination of the way in which our experience of any world is always already an experience of mind. These ideas rippled outward through Indian Buddhist thought for centuries, inspiring schools and sub-schools, commentaries upon commentaries, meditative practices designed to bring these philosophical insights out of the realm of intellectual understanding and into the direct lived experience of the practitioner. Because this is crucial to understanding Eastern philosophy as a whole, it was never merely academic. The great Eastern traditions shared a conviction, stated in different vocabularies, expressed through different practices, but unmistakably consistent, that philosophy without practice is incomplete. That understanding, to be genuine, must be embodied. That knowing about the nature of mind is radically different from knowing the nature of mind through direct, sustained, disciplined attention. And so, alongside every philosophical text, there was always a corresponding practice. Alongside the Upanishads, there were the practices of yoga, not in the limited physical sense the word often carries today, but in the full and ancient sense of disciplined union, a systematic training of body, breath, and attention designed to bring the practitioner into direct contact with what the texts were pointing toward. The word yoga itself comes from a Sanskrit root meaning to yoke, to join, to bring together, and its original meaning was precisely this joining of individual consciousness with the vast, luminous ground that the Upanishads called Brahman. It was a technology of awakening, as precise and as carefully developed as any technology the ancient world produced. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, composed perhaps in the 2nd century CE, though drawing on traditions far older, organized these practices into a coherent system of 8 limbs, ethical guidelines, physical postures, breath regulation, withdrawal of the senses, concentration, meditation, and finally samadhi, a state of absorption so complete that the boundary between the one who meditates and the object of meditation dissolves entirely. Alongside the teachings of the Buddha, there were the practices of vipassana, insight meditation, in which the practitioner sits in patient, precise attention, watching the arising and passing of each moment of experience without grasping or aversion, gradually coming to know in their own body and mind the truth of impermanence, the truth of suffering, the truth of the absence of a fixed and separate self. Alongside the Tao Te Ching, there were the practices of Qigong and Tai Chi, flowing movements calibrated to the natural rhythms of the body and the world, designed to cultivate the quality of presence and effortless action that Laozi described in the language of poetry. These practices were not supplements to the philosophy. They were the philosophy made flesh. The mountains stand very still in the dark beyond the window, their outlines barely visible against the deep indigo of the sky. And the lamp burns on, steady and patient, as it has always burned. And so the traditions grew, not in isolation, but in constant conversation with one another, each one responding to the others, borrowing and adapting, challenging and deepening, the way musicians in a long improvisation respond to what they hear, finding their own voice more fully by listening carefully to the voices around them. In India, the great period of classical philosophy that stretched from roughly the 4th through the 12th centuries CE became one of the most intellectually fertile eras in human history. Scholars and philosophers of extraordinary sophistication moved through the ancient universities, Nalanda, Vikramashila, Taxila, institutions that drew students from across Asia, from China and Tibet and Southeast Asia, from Central Asia and beyond. Nalanda alone, at its height, is estimated to have housed somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 students, with a library of such renown that accounts of its destruction by invasion in the 12th century describe the smoke from its burning texts rising for 3 months of burning to consume what centuries of human minds had gathered. It is one of the great losses of intellectual history, and yet the ideas themselves had already traveled too widely to be destroyed. They had been carried in the minds of monks and scholars along every trade route of the ancient world, copied into manuscripts in a dozen languages, woven into the practiced traditions of communities spread across an entire continent. Among the towering figures of this classical Indian period was Adi Shankaracharya, simply called Shankara, who lived in the 8th century CAE, and who, in the course of a life that ended when he was only 32 years old, produced a body of philosophical work of such brilliance and scope that it utterly transformed the landscape of Indian thought. Shankara was a defender and radical developer of the Advaita Vedanta tradition, the non-dual interpretation of the Upanishads. Advaita means not two, and Shankara's central argument, developed with a logical precision that his opponents found almost impossible to counter, was that the appearance of multiplicity and separateness in the world is a kind of fundamental misperception, what the tradition calls Maya, sometimes translated as illusion, though more precisely understood as the appearance of things as other than they are. There is only Brahman, Shankara insisted, only the one infinite, undivided, luminous ground of being, the appearance of a world of separate things, mountains and rivers and lamps and moths and individual human beings moving through their separate lives, is like the appearance of a snake when one looks at a rope in dim light. The snake is not there, but the rope is, and the seeing of the rope as snake is not nothing. It has consequences, it generates behavior, it causes real experiences of fear, until the light improves and the truth is seen clearly. This is one of the most audacious philosophical positions ever maintained by a serious thinker, and Shankara defended it not through mystical assertion, but through rigorous philosophical argumentation that engaged with every competing school of his time on their own terms. He traveled throughout India, from his birthplace in Kerala in the far south to the Himalayas in the north, from the eastern coast to the western, establishing monastic centers and debating the leading thinkers of every tradition he encountered. He wrote commentaries on the principal Upanishads, on the Bhagavad Gita, on the Brahma Sutras, the great synthesis texts of the Vedantic tradition, texts of such depth and elegance that they are still the primary reference points for Advaita philosophy today. But even within the Vedantic tradition, Shankara did not go unchallenged. Ramanuja, who lived in the 11th and 12th centuries CE, offered a powerful and deeply felt alternative vision. He agreed with Shankara that Brahman was the ultimate reality, but he argued that the world and individual souls, rather than being illusory projections within Brahman, were genuinely real, the actual body of Brahman, as it were, expressions of the divine that were neither identical with it nor separate from it, but related in the way that a body is related to the self that animates it. This philosophy, known as Vishishtadvaita, or qualified non-dualism, allowed for a quality of devotional relationship with the divine, that pure Advaita, with its emphasis on the ultimate identity of self and Brahman, made difficult to sustain. It opened the philosophical tradition to the great rivers of bhakti, devotional love, that were transforming Indian religious and cultural life during this period, filling it with poetry and music and the kind of direct, personal, emotionally immediate relationship with the sacred that speaks to something very deep in human experience. These debates between non-dualism and qualified non-dualism, between the path of knowledge and the path of devotion, between the ideal of the liberated sage and the ideal of the compassionate bodhisattva, were not merely academic disputes. They were expressions of something fundamental about the diversity of human temperament and the different ways in which human beings encounter and respond to the great questions of existence. Meanwhile, far to the east, the tradition of Buddhism was continuing its extraordinary journey of transformation. When Buddhism arrived in Tibet, beginning in earnest in the 7th century CE during the reign of King Songtsen Gampo, it encountered a culture with its own ancient spiritual traditions, its own ritual practices, its own relationship with the landscape of those extraordinary high-altitude plains and the vast mountain ranges that surrounded them. The encounter produced something unique in the history of world, religion, and philosophy. Tibetan Buddhism absorbed the full philosophical sophistication of late Indian Buddhist thought, the Madhyamaka philosophy of Nagarjuna, the Yogacara of Vasubandhu, the elaborate tantric practices that had developed in India over centuries, and combined them with a structural emphasis on the teacher-student relationship, on elaborate ritual and iconography, and on a systematic approach to the cultivation of consciousness that is arguably the most detailed and comprehensive such system ever developed. The Tibetan tradition organized the path of awakening into a vast and intricate framework, preserving teachings that might otherwise have been lost when the great Indian universities were destroyed, translating an enormous body of Sanskrit texts into Tibetan with extraordinary care and precision, and developing original commentary and practice traditions of remarkable depth. One of the most extraordinary documents of this tradition is the text known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, a text designed to be read aloud to the dying and the recently deceased, guiding consciousness through the transitional states between death and rebirth. It describes in luminous and sometimes overwhelming detail a series of experiences that the consciousness encounters after death, experiences that the tradition maintains are reflections of one's own mind, projections of the awareness that was always already present, now encountered without the organizing frameworks of a living body. Whether one interprets this text literally or metaphorically, it is a document of extraordinary psychological insight, a map of states of consciousness so detailed and so carefully observed that modern researchers and psychologists have returned to it again and again, finding in its ancient framework something that resonates with contemporary understanding of the mind. In Japan, meanwhile, the tradition of Zen was developing in ways that were distinctly and beautifully Japanese. Zen arrived in Japan principally through two great teachers, Eisai, who established the Rinzai school in the late 12th century, and Dogen, who founded the Soto school in the early 13th century. These two schools embodied complementary approaches to the central question of Zen practice, the question of how awakening is to be realized. The Rinzai school placed great emphasis on the koan, a precisely crafted paradoxical question or statement given by a teacher to a student, designed to exhaust the conceptual mind and force an opening into a more direct mode of knowing. What is the sound of one hand clapping? What was your original face before your parents were born? These are not questions with answers. They are questions designed to break the ordinary machinery of question and answer entirely, to push the mind to the edge of what it can grasp conceptually, and then gently, firmly push it off that edge into something wider. The Soto school, associated with the profound and often deeply poetic writings of Dogen Zenji, placed its emphasis on shikantaza, simply sitting, the practice of seated meditation as itself the complete expression of awakening, not as a means to some future state, but as the immediate, full, unconditional presence of mind meeting the present moment. Dogen's great philosophical work, the Shobogenzo, or Treasury of the True Dharma I, is one of the most original and demanding philosophical texts in the Buddhist tradition, written in a Japanese so compressed and paradoxical that it has challenged translators and commentators for 8 centuries. In it, Dogen explores questions of time, being, language, and consciousness, with an intimacy and precision that feels simultaneously ancient and startlingly modern. To study the self, he wrote, is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the 10,000 things. These words have been sitting in the world for nearly 8 centuries now, and they have not grown old. As the centuries continued to turn, the great Eastern traditions began to encounter, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with difficulty, the expanding presence of Western civilization. Trade routes brought not only goods but ideas. Missionaries carried their own philosophical and theological frameworks into conversations with Confucian scholars and Hindu pandits, and Buddhist monks who had their own frameworks of equal or greater sophistication. Colonial powers reorganized ancient societies in ways that disrupted traditional structures of learning and practice. And yet the traditions endured, adapted, found new forms. In the 19th century, a remarkable series of figures emerged who began the work of reintroducing Eastern philosophy to its own people in forms suited to the contemporary world, while simultaneously opening a dialogue with the West that would prove transformative for both. Swami Vivekananda, a young Bengali monk, a direct disciple of the great mystic Ramakrishna, arrived at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago in 1893 and addressed the assembled delegates with a greeting that began Sisters and Brothers of America, and drew a standing ovation before he had said anything else. What he went on to say was a passionate, brilliant, deeply informed presentation of Vedantic philosophy, arguing not for the superiority of any tradition over any other, but for the recognition of a unity underlying all spiritual paths, a recognition that the different traditions of the world were not contradictions of one another, but different languages attempting to speak the same ultimate truth. He spent the next several years lecturing across America and Europe, founding the Vedanta Society, writing and speaking with an energy and clarity that introduced tens of thousands of Westerners to Indian philosophical thought for the first time, and simultaneously inspiring a renewal of pride and philosophical self-awareness among educated Indians who had, under colonial influence, been led to doubt the value of their own traditions. In Japan, the philosopher and Zen teacher D.T. Suzuki was undertaking a parallel project, translating and interpreting Zen Buddhist thought for Western audiences with such skill and sensitivity that his influence on 20th century Western intellectual and artistic life is difficult to overstate. That the beat writers, the abstract expressionist painters, the early pioneers of what would become the mindfulness movement, all of them passed through the gateway that Suzuki opened. And in China, as the 20th century brought convulsions of political and social upheaval, the ancient traditions found themselves under extraordinary pressure. Confucian thought, which had organized Chinese social and political life for 2,000 years, was challenged and in some periods actively suppressed. Taoist and Buddhist communities struggled to maintain their practices through decades of dramatic change, yet something persisted. Something in these traditions proved again and again to be more resilient than the political circumstances that surrounded them, because they had always been, at their deepest level, about something that no external circumstance could finally reach. They were about the nature of awareness itself, about what is present before thought arises, about the quality of attention brought to a single breath, a single moment, a single cup of tea held in two hands in the quiet of an ordinary morning. And it is perhaps here, in this recognition of what these traditions were really pointing toward, that the historical narrative gently opens into something larger and more interior, because the story of Eastern philosophy is not only a story about the past, it is a story about what happens when a human mind grows quiet enough to notice what was always already present. The lamp in the window does not try to illuminate anything. It simply burns, and the light goes where it will. There is something that all of these traditions, in their different vocabularies and different cultural clothing, seem to agree upon. Something so simple that it is easy to pass over, the way one might walk past a small wildflower growing in the crack of an ancient stone wall without noticing the extraordinary fact of its existence. The ordinary mind, the mind as it usually operates, moving from thought to thought, pulled by desire and pushed by aversion, narrating and judging and planning and remembering, is not the whole of what we are. Beneath it or within it, or perhaps more accurately as its very ground, there is something else. The Upanishads called it the witness, the pure awareness that observes all experience without being caught by any of it, the silence within which all sounds arise and into which they finally dissolve. The Buddha pointed toward it when he described the mind of a fully awakened being, not a mind emptied of experience, but a mind so fully present to experience that nothing sticks to it, the way water does not cling to the lotus leaf. Laozi gestured toward it with his image of the Tao, the nameless, the ungraspable, the presence that is somehow more intimate than anything we could name or reach toward. Dogen pointed at it when he wrote of simply sitting, not sitting in order to achieve something, but sitting as the complete expression of what is already the case. What is remarkable is not that these traditions arrived at similar insights. What is remarkable is the diversity of paths they found to the same clearing. Some paths moved through rigorous philosophical reasoning, through the kind of careful, sustained logical analysis that dismantles false assumptions one by one, the way a sculptor removes everything that is not the figure within the stone. Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka philosophy is perhaps the supreme example of this, a philosophical method so precise that it has been compared by contemporary philosophers to the most rigorous analytical traditions of the Western Academy. And yet its destination was not a conclusion but a dissolution, the falling away of the very conceptual frameworks through which reality had been filtered. Other paths moved through devotion, through the cultivated opening of the heart towards something larger than itself. The great bhakti poets of medieval India, Mirabai, Kabir, Tukaram, wrote verses of such raw emotional intensity, such unguarded longing and love, that reading them even today feels like standing too close to a fire. They were not interested in philosophical argument. They were interested in burning. Mirabai, the 16th century Rajput princess who abandoned her royal life to wander as a devotee of Krishna, wrote in a voice of such complete surrender that her poems have been sung by ordinary people in Indian villages for 5 centuries. She did not care about doctrinal correctness or philosophical precision. She cared about the direct experience of love so complete that the boundary between lover and beloved disappeared. This, too, is Eastern philosophy. The fire and the flower and the rigorous argument and the paradoxical koan are all instruments playing in the same vast ensemble. There is a concept in Japanese aesthetics closely related to the Zen tradition called wabi-sabi. It points toward a quality of beauty that is found not in perfection or permanence, but in imperfection and transience. In the rough glaze of an imperfectly fired tea bowl, in the asymmetry of a garden stone, in the single branch of plum blossom against an empty winter sky. Wabi-sabi is the aesthetic expression of impermanence, of the Buddhist truth of anicca, which holds that all conditioned things arise and pass away, that nothing in the realm of experience holds its shape forever. And rather than meeting this truth with grief or resistance, wabi-sabi meets it with a kind of gentle, open-eyed appreciation, finding in the very fact of transience a quality of poignancy that makes beautiful things more beautiful, not less. The Japanese poet Matsuo Basho, the great 17th century master of haiku, gave this quality its most perfect expression in a poem so short it can be held in a single breath. An old silent pond. A frog jumps into the pond. Splash. Silence again. 17 syllables. And within them, somehow, the whole of it. The stillness that exists before and after the brief eruption of sound, the way any moment of experience arises within a larger quietness that it does not disturb, only briefly touches, the impermanence of the splash against the permanence of the water, the presence required to notice all of this in the first place. There is also the concept of interconnectedness, what the Buddhist tradition calls Indra's net, an ancient image from the Avatamsaka Sutra of an infinite net stretching in all directions with a jewel at every node, and every jewel reflecting every other jewel, so that to look into any one jewel is to see, reflected within it, the light of all the others. This image was composed perhaps 15 centuries ago, and yet it describes with breathtaking accuracy something that contemporary physics and ecology and systems theory are only beginning to articulate in their own languages. That reality is not a collection of separate things interacting from outside each other, but a seamless web of mutual arising in which the identity of each element is constituted by its relationships with all the others. The ecologist sees this in the forest. The physicist sees it in the behavior of entangled particles. The meditator sees it in the quiet observation of a single breath, noticing that this breath is made of air that has been breathed by countless other beings, that the oxygen entering the blood with each inhalation is the gift of ancient forests and ocean algae, that the boundary of the body is less a wall than a membrane, a place of constant exchange rather than separation. And this is perhaps the most quietly radical gift that Eastern philosophy offers to the modern world, not as an exotic import or a spiritual commodity, but as a genuine alternative framework for understanding what we are and how we are related to everything else. The modern world has been shaped in profound ways by a philosophical tradition that emphasizes separation, the separation of self from world, of mind from body, of human beings from the natural systems that sustain them. These separations have had consequences, some of them magnificent, producing the extraordinary achievements of science and technology and individual human freedom, and some of them deeply troubling, producing the isolation and fragmentation that so many people in the modern world feel as a kind of unnamed ache at the center of their lives. Eastern philosophy does not offer a simple cure for this ache. It does not offer simple cures for anything. It offers instead a different way of looking, a looking that begins with the willingness to sit quietly with what is actually present, without immediately reaching to change or fix or explain it. And in that sitting, something begins to shift. Very slowly, the way the sky shifts from deep indigo toward the first pale intimation of dawn, not dramatically, not all at once, but continuously, patiently, in a direction that cannot be reversed. The mountains that have been watching through the window all this time have not moved. They will not move. And yet in the hours of this long, quiet night, something in the quality of attention with which they are seen has gently changed. The mist in the valley has thinned slightly, just enough that the river is visible again, a dark ribbon of movement catching the faint reflected light of stars, still carrying its ancient water toward the sea, still murmuring in its low and steady voice. The lamp in the window has burned steadily through all of it, through the Vedic hymns and the Upanishadic dialogues and the night beneath the Bodhi tree, through the 81 paradoxes of the Tao Te Ching and the ethical conversations of Confucius on the dusty roads of the Zhou Kingdom, through the burning library of Nalanda and the translation chambers of Tibetan monasteries and the silent halls where Zen students sat through long winter nights with their impossible questions. It has burned through all of this, and it is still burning. There is something consoling about that image, something that has nothing to do with argument or doctrine or the careful parsing of philosophical positions. It is simply the fact of a flame that persists. In the Zen tradition, there is a phrase, tathata. It means suchness or thusness, the simple, bare, unadorned fact of things as they are, before interpretation overlays them, before the mind reaches to categorize and explain, the raw presence of this moment, exactly as it is, needing nothing added and nothing taken away. Tathata is not a state to be achieved. It is not a reward for correct philosophical understanding or diligent meditation practice. It is what is already the case, already fully present, in every moment the way the sky is already fully present, whether or not we look up at it, whether or not we know the word for sky, whether or not we understand anything at all about the physics of light and atmosphere that makes it appear as it does. The Eastern philosophical traditions, in all their extraordinary diversity, are perhaps best understood as different ways of pointing toward this already present Hobais reality, different gestures towards something that cannot be given because it is already here, different fingers pointing at the same moon. And the moon does not mind how many fingers point at it. It simply shines. The night has grown very deep now. The mountains are still. The mist in the valley drifts in slow, unhurried arabesques, following some current of air too gentle to be called wind. The river moves on below it, faithful and untroubled, as it has moved for longer than any human tradition can remember. The lamp in the window has burned down somewhat, its flame a little lower, a little softer, casting a warmer and more intimate light on the stone walls of the room where all these ideas have been gathered tonight. Somewhere in the distance, very far away, or perhaps very close, a single bell sounds, the kind of bell that is struck once and then allowed to ring until the sound decides for itself when to stop, and the sound goes out into the night like a breath, like a question that has learned not to insist on an answer, spreading in gentle rings through the dark air until it becomes indistinguishable from the silence around it. This is the gift these traditions offer, not certainty, not a fixed map of the cosmos or a guaranteed path to happiness, but something more intimate and more durable than either of those things, the gift of a quality of attention, a willingness to be present to what is actually here, to sit with the not knowing long enough for something to clarify on its own terms, in its own time, in the way that stars clarify out of the darkening sky as the last light of evening fades, not appearing from nowhere, but becoming visible as the conditions for seeing them come gradually into place. The Vedas are still singing somewhere, their ancient syllables moving through time the way light moves through dark water, slowly, changing direction, losing none of its essential nature. The Buddha is still sitting beneath his tree, or rather the quality of attention he embodied is still available, present in this moment and the next, needing only the willingness to notice it. Laozi's river is still finding the low places, still shaping its patient way through stone, still arriving without effort at the sea. And somewhere in the quietness between thoughts, in the space that is always there, however briefly glimpsed, something is present that has no name in any language and needs none. The lamp grows softer. The mountains breathe their slow and ancient breath. The river moves on, and the night holds everything gently in its vast and patient arms, neither grasping nor releasing, simply here, simply this, simply so.